Section 13 of Sea-Power in the Pacific by Hector Charles Bywater. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Alister. Chapter 8. The Japanese Navy, Torpedo-Craft, Submarines, and Aircraft. For obvious reasons, the torpedo has been from its inception a favourite weapon with those countries which have to maintain a naval establishment on limited funds. The high degree of efficiency attained by the torpedo branch of the old German Navy was due to the circumstance that special attention had been paid to the development and use of this arm from the days when Germany did not feel wealthy enough to afford the luxury of a great ironclad fleet. Motives of economy also led Japan to provide herself with torpedo-craft at a very early stage of her naval career. She began in 1879 by ordering 4 small boats in England. Built by Messrs. Yarrow, they were 40 tons displacement and 100 feet in length. Engines of 620 horsepower gave them a speed of 20 knots in smooth water. These little craft having proved quite successful, a much larger experimental boat was ordered from Yarrow's in 1885. This was the Kotaka, a 170-foot boat displacing 190 tons with a speed of 19 knots. A novel feature was the armouring of her machinery compartments with 1-inch steel plates, the rest of the hull being very minutely subdivided by watertight bulkheads. This made her practically immune from serious injury by the machine guns, which at that period were carried by large ships for repelling torpedo attack. The Kotaka was armed with 6 14-inch torpedo tubes and 4 machine guns. In 1888, 17 first-class torpedo boats were ordered from France. They were all of the same type, 115 foot long, displacement 56 tons, speed 20 knots, and armed with 14-inch torpedoes. Many of them were shipped from France in sections and put together at Kobe. In 1890, single specimen boats were ordered from France and Germany, from the designs of which about 35 similar craft were built in Japan. These were 90-tonners, with a speed of 23 knots, and together with the older vessels they bore the brunt of the torpedo fighting at Port Arthur and Wei Highway during the China War. They materially assisted in the capture of Port Arthur by dashing boldly into the harbour under the cover of a rain squall and machine-gunning the Chinese troops on shore. This daring feat was highly commended by foreign officers who witnessed the attack. From Port Arthur they proceeded to Wei Highway, where the Chinese Admiral Ting had taken refuge with his fleet. In the course of 4 successive night attacks, undertaken in appalling weather and in the face of determined resistance, they torpedoed 4 ships and so damaged the remainder that Ting found it expedient to surrender. During the next 10 years, the Japanese torpedo flotilla was greatly enlarged. A number of fine 30-knot destroyers were ordered from England, and many smaller boats were built in Japan, so that when the war with Russia broke out in 1904, the flotilla comprised about 20 destroyers, 58 first-class and 30 second-class torpedo boats. Some mention has already been made of the torpedo attack on Port Arthur, which practically immobilized the Russian squadron at the beginning of hostilities. But after having so brilliantly inaugurated the war, the Japanese torpedo service did not afterwards enjoy many opportunities of distinguishing itself. Later attacks on the Port Arthur squadron met with indifferent success, and at the great naval action of Tsushima, the work of the destroyers was limited to administering the coup de grace to disabled Russian ships. Between 1905 and 1909, 35 third-class destroyers were built in the Yokosuka, Kure, Maizuru, Sasebo, Osaka, Kobe, Nagasaki, and Yuragi yards. All these vessels were constructed to a standard design. Displacement 380 tons, 226 feet long, speed 29 knots, with a coal capacity of 100 tons. They had a radius of 1,200 miles at a speed of 15 knots. As experience during the war with Russia had demonstrated the value of powerful artillery in vessels of the destroyer type, each of these 36 boats were given the exceptionally heavy armament of 6 12-pounder guns, together with 2 torpedo tubes. From 1909 to the outbreak of the Great War, very few destroyers were built in Japan. The only boats completed within this period were 2 of the first and 2 of the second class. The former pair, however, were the largest and most formidable destroyers afloat when they were completed. They were 324 feet long, displaced 1,150 tons, and had a speed of 31.5 knots, while enough fuel could be carried for a run of nearly 3,000 miles at economical speed. The armament consisted of 2 4.5-inch and 5 12-pounder quick-firing guns and 4 torpedo tubes. These two vessels, the Yumikaze and the Yamakaze, are properly described as flotilla leaders, and but for the fact they were antedated by HMS Swift, the Japanese Navy might have claimed the distinction of originating a type which was widely adopted and developed in the course of the Great War. When Japan declared war on Germany, special credits for the expansion of the Navy were voted by the Diet. This enabled the government to augment the destroyer flotilla, which had been sorely neglected in the previous 5 years. 10 second-class boats, known as the Kaba class, were therefore ordered and put in hand for completion at the earliest possible moment. As a matter of fact, they were all delivered in less than 8 months from the laying of the keel, and the majority of them afterwards served as convoy guards and U-boat hunters in the Mediterranean, where they did excellent work. They displace 665 tons with a speed of 30 knots, and, having the large fuel capacity of 230 tons of coal and oil, they have a wider steaming radius than is usual in boats of this tonnage. The armament of 1 4.7-inch and 4 12-pounder guns, which they now carry, may be altered to 2 4.7-inch and 1 12-pounder anti-aircraft gun. There are 4 tubes for the 18-inch torpedo. The 1915 programme legislated for 8 destroyers, 4 of which were first-class, and the remainder second-class boats. The first quartet, Amatsukaze, Isokaze, Hamakaze, and Takitsukaze, were the largest destroyers which had been built up to then for the Japanese Navy. They displace 1,227 tons and have a speed of 34 knots. With 350 tons of fuel on board, they can steam at nearly 4,000 miles at economical speed. The armament is remarkably powerful, comprising 4 4.7-inch quick-firers, several machine guns, and 6 torpedo tubes. The 4 second-class boats were of 835 tons and 31.5 knots speed, armed with 3 4.7-inch quick-firers. In the following year, only 2 destroyers were authorised, viz. Tanikaze and Kawakaze, but they were exceptionally large vessels, displacing 1,300 tons. The speed remained at 34 knots, and the gun armament was reduced to 3 4.7-inch guns, but this apparent decrease in fighting power was balanced by the substitution of 21-inch torpedoes for the 18-inch type carried by all previous Japanese destroyers. 6 tubes for the new torpedo were mounted in each vessel. The 21-inch torpedo first applied to the Tanikaze class is of Japanese design and manufacture. Although modelled on the Whitehead prototype, it is said to embody important improvements and to have a range of 10,000 yards. As early as 1910, experiments were made with a Japanese torpedo of 23.5-inch diameter, fitted with a petrol motor in place of ordinary compressed air engines. This, however, does not appear to have been a success, for no more was heard of it. Torpedoes of the 21-inch and 18-inch models are now produced at the Kure Arsenal, the Muroran Steelworks, the Osaka Ironworks, and, possibly, at 1 or 2 of the larger private establishments which executed heavy contracts for the Navy during the war. The total output in 1918 was 320 torpedoes, but there is now good authority for the statement that at least twice this number could now be manufactured every year. Footnote: during 1920, the Kobe Ironworks alone manufactured 250 torpedoes. End of footnote. In common with other progressive naval powers, Japan is continually experimenting with a view to improving the torpedo, and it is quite possible that her latest product is a far more formidable weapon than the 21-inch torpedo introduced in 1916. The programme for 1917 included 2 large and 6 second-class destroyers. The Minakaze and Sawakaze were slightly enlarged copies of the Tanikaze class, the displacement being increased to 1,345 tons, and the gun armament to 4 4.7-inch. The 6 smaller boats were duplicates of the Momo class, built in 1915. 13 further boats, 5 first-class, 8 second-class, were authorised in 1918. The large boats were identical with the Minakaze class of 1,345 tons, but the 8 smaller destroyers were of 850 tons, steaming at 32 knots and armed with 3 4.7-inch guns, and 4 21-inch torpedo tubes. One boat of this class, the Suga, attained a speed slightly above 34 knots on trial. The programs of 1919 and 1920 made provision for a total of 8 first-class and 13 second-class destroyers. Such details as have been attained show the 8 first-class vessels to be exceedingly powerful. They are named Akakazi, Yukazi, Hokazi, Shiokazi, Tachikazi, Namikazi, Numikazi, and Nokazi. Displacing 1,900 to 2,200 tons, they are 350 feet in length and have geared turbines of 50,000 horsepower to endow them with a speed of 36 knots. The fuel capacity is expected to suffice for a run of 3,500 sea miles at economical speed. 4 5.5-inch 82-pounder quick-firing guns and 6 torpedo tubes will constitute the armament. Of the 40 new destroyers to be built under the 1920 through 1928 program, more than half of which has been ordered by the end of 1920, it is anticipated that 15 will be of the first class and the remainder of the second class. According to Japanese press reports, the former will be torpedo cruisers rather than destroyers, and may displace as much as 2,400 tons. Capable of making 37 knots at full speed, they will have a steaming radius of 4,000 sea miles, and will be armed with 5 5.5-inch guns and 8 torpedo tubes. One journal states, however, that the armament has been modified to 6 4.7-inch guns. With the completion of all the vessels building, or authorized to be built, the Japanese torpedo flotilla will consist of 37 first-class destroyers, from 1,150 to 2,400 tons, with speeds ranging from 32 to 37 knots, and 69 second-class destroyers, from 605 to 950 tons, and speeds ranging from 30 to 36 knots. All of these vessels carry as their armament 1 or more guns of 4.7-inch caliber, which discharges a projectile of 45 pounds weight, as compared with the 4-inch 33-pounder which forms the armament of American destroyers. All Japanese destroyers, without exception, are very strongly constructed and are designed to keep the sea in the heaviest weather. They are handled with great skill, both in deck and engineering departments, and in spite of the dangerous weather in which they are continually exercising, accidents are as rare as machinery breakdowns. Both in organisation and methods of training, the Japanese destroyer service is closely modelled on the German pattern, the efficiency of which has never been questioned. Night manoeuvres with masked lights are of a frequent occurrence. During the fleet manoeuvres of 1919, in which 24 modern destroyers took part, they scored many successes, and their work was the subject of special commendation from the umpires. The Japanese destroyers, which formed part of the Allied fleet in the Mediterranean during the last 2 years of the war, invariably carried out their duties with a seaman-like smartness that earned them high praise from foreign observers, including Admiral Sir Somerset Gough Calthrop, under whose orders they were placed. At the close of the war, the destroyer service was organised on a new basis, a full flotilla consisting of 2 first-class and 10 second-class boats. The officer in charge of each flotilla is of a captain's rank. He is nearly always a torpedo specialist, while the second-in-command of the flotilla is a commander who has specialised in navigation. As in other vessels of the Japanese Navy, the destroyers carry very large complements. In the manoeuvres of 1919, the Matsukaze, of 1,227 tons, which led one of the flotillas, had a complement of 200 on board, including 9 commissioned officers, while the second-class boats of 835 tons averaged 140 officers and men. Since the beginning of 1920, a system of direct-to-fire control has been adopted for the armament of all destroyers. Great attention is paid in the flotillas to gunnery, but torpedo work is not neglected. Every destroyer of the first and second class carries an artificer who has undergone a special course of training in the maintenance and adjustment of torpedoes, and has passed a very severe examination in this work. He is officially rated as torpedo adjusting artificer, and draws special pay. As long ago as 1909, a Japanese writer had this to say of the submarine branch of the Imperial Navy.
It is commonly reported that there are 9 submarines in the Japanese service, but in a very short time, ordinary torpedo boats will be superseded by submarines designed and built in Japan. The construction of submarines is a most secret section of the Japanese Navy. The type of vessel itself is recondite. Why should not the service be recondite? At the critical hour, it will be strange indeed if the authorities find themselves unable to utilize some 32 submarine boats simultaneously.
In March 1919, the Tokyo journal Jiji Shimpo wrote on the same subject as follows.
We notice statements in America to the effect that the Japanese Navy is deficient in submarines, that the boats it possesses are inferior to foreign types, and that Japanese naval officers have had little or no experience in the manipulation of the submarine arm on modern principles. Such statements are entirely misleading, not to say false. The Imperial Navy Department does not encourage the advertisement of its technical successes, and it particularly observes reticence in regard to the submarine branch. This, however, does not mean that the Japanese Navy is behindhand with submarine preparations. On the contrary, it was one of the first to realize and exploit the war possibilities of underwater vessels, and for nearly 15 years it has been strengthening the submarine branch, both in quantity and quality, so far as financial resources have permitted. Our submarine fleet at the present time is still growing, and will be much larger a few years from now. But it has already reached a level of efficiency which affords great satisfaction to the initiated, who would not have the least difficulty in refuting these American assertions, if they felt so disposed.
It is quite true, as the Tokyo Journal states, that Japan was early in the field with submarines. In 1902, a Japanese naval mission visited the United States, France and England to study submarine progress in those countries, and 12 months later, on the eve of war with Russia, money was voted for the construction in America of 5 boats of the Holland type, which the mission had reported as being the most suitable for Japanese requirements. These vessels were built by the Fall River Shipbuilding Company at Quincy, near Boston, the contract stipulating that the utmost secrecy should be preserved. Several Japanese officers remained at the yard while the boats were under construction, and accompanied them, when they were loaded, in sections, on special railway trucks and railed to Seattle, whence they were brought by steamer to Yokohama, arriving there on the 12th of December 1904. For some unknown reason, the work of reassembling the boats and fitting them out for sea was so retarded that the first was not ready for service until June 1905, by which date Russian sea power in the Far East had been utterly shattered. Consequently, it was too late to try the boats in actual warfare. But all 5 made a very successful debut at the Naval Review, held at the close of 1905, to celebrate the signing of peace. These early submarines are still on the active list, though they are now used only for instructional purposes. Their displacement on the surface is 105 tons, and when submerged 130 tons. The length overall is 58 3/4 feet, the maximum depth 11 3/4 feet, and a petrol engine, driving a single screw, gives a speed on the surface of 9 knots. They differ from contemporary Holland boats by the remarkable strength of the hull, a feature which, for reasons that will appear in due course, has been perpetuated in all later Japanese submarines. Steel of the highest quality was used in their construction, the hull being reinforced amidships by a broad strip of bronze plate. The 2 bilge keels, 24.5 feet long by 9 inches wide, were fitted to the hull, which was designed to withstand the pressure that would be experienced at a depth of 125 feet below the surface. The armament consisted of the bow torpedo tube, and 3 torpedoes, including 1 in the tube, were carried by each boat, the crew of which numbered 13. 2 modified Hollands, numbers 6 and 7, were built at Kobe in 1906 through 1907, They were much smaller than the original type, displacing only 62 tons on the surface and 86.5 tons when submerged. But they were similar in respect of speed, armament, and size of crew. Notwithstanding their diminutive size, and the fact that several unconventional features were incorporated in them, at the request of the Imperial Navy Department, these two boats turned out to be quite successful. Under the command of Lieutenant Sato, No. 6 distinguished herself in the manoeuvres of 1911 by torpedoing the battleship Kashima in the midst of the fleet. For the next few years, the development of the Japanese submarines ran practically parallel with that of the British type. Numbers 8 and 9, built at Barrow in 1908 by Messrs. Vickers, were identical in all main features with the British C-class. Their dimensions were length 135 feet, breadth 13.5 feet, displacement above water 280 tons, below water 320 tons. Petrol engines operating twin screws gave a surface speed of 13 knots. When running submerged on the electromotor, a speed of 7 knots was attained. 2 tubes were mounted and 4 torpedoes carried. 2 periscopes are fitted, one for the captain and the other for the lookout man. Submarines numbers 10 to 13 were the first boats to be completed in Japan, though their design was the joint work of Messrs. Vickers and the Japanese Construction Department, and certain items of material and equipment were imported from England. They differ in no important respect from boats numbers 8 and 9, and may be regarded as slight improvements on the British C-class. Number 12 had a purely Japanese arrangement of torpedo tubes, which did not give good results, and was therefore replaced in 1913. The last 2 boats of this type were numbers 16 and 17, built at Kure in 1916. Except that they had 4 bow tubes and slightly more speed, they were repetitions of numbers 8 and 9, built 8 years previously. The fact that Japan should have adhered to this design for so long testifies to its excellent qualities. But while these small boats were quite satisfactory for the purpose of coast defence, Japan was anxious to evolve a seagoing type, capable of cruising far from its base and having a radius of at least 2,000 miles. 2 such boats, numbers 14 and 15, were ordered in France in 1912, to the designs of Monsieur Leboeuf, and built at Chalon-sur-Saône. The type has a length of 185 feet and surface displacement of 457 tons, which increases to 665 tons when the vessel is submerged. Propulsion on the surface is by diesel motors, giving a speed of 17 knots, while below the water a rate of 10 knots can be maintained. 6 18-inch torpedo tubes are mounted, 2 being placed in the bows and 4 being built into the superstructure. The contract called for a cruising radius of at least 2,200 miles in surface trim, but it is probable that the boats could travel a much greater distance than this on one filling of fuel. As only one of these boats, number 15, had been completed on the outbreak of the Great War, the second one, number 14, was relinquished to France and incorporated in her navy. A substitute for the missing boat was laid down at Kure in 1916, but of a larger type, which will be described later. The first ocean-going submarines to be built in Japan were numbers 18 and 21, the design of which emanated from Italy. They are 195 feet in length, and when submerged displace 980 tons. 4 18-inch torpedo tubes are fitted, one of which is at the stern. The design speed of these boats was 17.5 knots, but it has never been actually reached, owing, no doubt, to the amount of extra weight worked into the hull by the Japanese builders, who considered the original scantlings too light. The cruising radius of number 18 is approximately 3,000 sea miles. All the foregoing submarines were modified copies of standard British, French, or Italian designs. In 1916, however, the Japanese Navy Department produced a design of its own, which is claimed to present certain valuable features not found in previous boats. With the exception of the first 5 diminutive Hollands, the submarines planned to Japanese order by foreign builders are said to be lacking in the extraordinary strength of hull which is regarded as an indispensable feature of submarines operating in the waters adjacent to Japan. The average depth is so great that submarines can rarely lie on the bottom. Moreover, it has been found by experience that submarine navigation in those waters presents dangers and difficulties not encountered in the sea areas of Europe. Apart from the enormous depth of water and the rocky nature of the seabed, a submarine is liable to meet with powerful and erratic currents, which tend both to drive it out of its course and produce sudden changes in trim. In order to counteract this danger, it is necessary that the internal mechanism of the boat should lend itself to instant and perfect control, especially in regard to the hydroplanes and pumping system, and above all, that the hull should be sufficiently robust to withstand the hydrostatic pressure to which it would be subjected in the event of an involuntary descent below the nominal safety limit. To obtain these qualities in their submarines, the Japanese constructors are willing to sacrifice high surface speed, though in their latest types they have contrived to embody this desideratum as well. Thanks to the special form and the extra stiffening of the hull structure, the modern Japanese submarine is probably the most strongly built vessel of its type in the world. The Imperial Navy claims to have broken all records for deep diving, and, at the same time, to have suffered fewer fatal accidents with its submarines than any other navy. This does not mean that Japanese submarines are handled with unusual caution, or that they never meet with accidents. Quite the contrary. But their stout construction often brings them safely through groundings, collisions, and other misadventures, which in all likelihood would prove disastrous to vessels less strongly built. One disadvantage of the Japanese system of building submarines is that the abnormal amount of bulkheading and subdivision in them makes the boats very cramped and uncomfortable, in which respect they are inferior to most foreign designs. This drawback is intensified by the large complement borne in each boat, but in the Japanese Navy no great premium is placed upon personal comfort, and the submarine service, with all its hardships, is exceedingly popular. It is doubtful whether a European or American crew could remain at sea in a small submarine such as the Japanese No. 16 for more than 10 days or a fortnight without being reduced to the point of physical and mental exhaustion. Yet this same vessel made during 1919 a cruise lasting 3 weeks, touching at only 3 ports, and then for the space of a few hours only. As a general rule, the actual cruising radius of a submarine is considerably less than its fuel endurance by reason of the mental and physical strain which prolonged voyages in this type of craft impose upon the human element. Thus, the large German submersibles of the Deutschland and New Cruiser classes were never able to remain at sea for anything like the full limit of their fuel and provision capacity, and on returning to port their officers and men were invariably worn out. Japanese seamen, on the other hand, appear to be less affected by the confinement and rigours of submarine service, notwithstanding that the habitability of their boats leaves much to be desired. Without attempting to give precise figures, it would probably be safe to assume that of 2 submarines with identical design, tonnage, and fuel capacity, one manned by Japanese and the other by Westerners, the former could remain at sea 30% longer than the other boat. Submarine No. 19, the first representative of the new seagoing type of purely Japanese design, was begun at Kure towards the end of 1916 and completed nearly 3 years later. The length overall is 192 feet, the extreme breadth 24.5 feet, and the displacement when submerged is 890 tons. A surface speed of 16 knots had been anticipated, but the maximum speed on trial, with the boat in light condition, was barely 15.5 knots. The oil supply of 75 tons is sufficient for a continuous voyage of 6,500 sea miles at economical speed. The number of torpedo tubes is not definitely known, but there are said to be 3 in the bow and 2 at the stern. When first commissioned, No. 19 carried a 12-pounder quick-firing gun. She is now believed to mount 2 of these weapons. Submarines Numbers 14 and 20, the former built in place of the boat ceded to France, are exact copies of No. 19, save that their speed is higher, by the fraction of a knot. Numbers 22, 23 and 24 are developments of the same type, with the displacement increased to 950 tons, the length to 196 feet, and the breadth to 25 feet. No change has been made in the speed or armament. The next two boats, numbers 25 and 26, are variously reported to be of 950 and 1,000 tons displacement, and 16.5 knot speed, with an armament of 4 tubes and one 4.7-inch gun of short caliber. Their cruising radius is at least 7,500 miles. 16 further seagoing submarines were laid down in the 2 years ending December 1920. According to reliable information, they displace 1,100 tons below water, are 240 feet in length, and have a speed of 17 knots on the surface and 9.5 knots when submerged. There are 4 torpedo tubes in the bows and possibly one on each beam. The maximum supply of 90 tons of oil gives them a cruising endurance of 11,000 miles. The last of this group of 16 boats will not be in service before the end of 1921. 8 new submarines, 4 seagoing and 4 coastal boats, covered by the naval program of 1919, were to have been commenced in the following year, but before they were laid down an event had occurred which is believed to have brought about an important modification in Japanese ideas on submarine design. This event was the arrival at Yokosuka on the 20th of June 1919 of 7 ex-German submarines which had been allotted to Japan for experimental and propaganda purposes by the Inter-Allied Naval Council in Paris. These 7 vessels had previously been closely examined by Japanese experts in Europe, and were, indeed, selected by them as representing the most useful types from the Japanese point of view. They comprised 1 large mine layer, 2 medium and 2 small ocean-going boats, and 2 small mine layers. The large mine layer, Submarine 01, completed during 1918 as the German U-125, has a surface displacement of 1,163 tons, is 267.5 feet in length, and can travel on the surface at a speed of nearly 15 knots. With all tanks filled, the oil supply is 189 tons, which would enable the vessel to cover a distance of no less than 11,500 sea miles. A 5.9-inch 101-pounder quick-firing gun is mounted on the deck, and there are 4 bow tubes for discharging torpedoes, 24 of which can be stowed in the boat. The mine-laying equipment consists of a magazine containing 42 mines at the after end of the boat and 2 horizontal chutes through which the mines are projected into the water. The formidable qualities of this vessel are self-evident. She could cruise halfway round the globe without replenishing her fuel supply. She carries a heavy long-range gun which would enable her to attack any armed merchant ship or even a small man of war with good prospects of success. She has a powerful torpedo battery, and finally she carries enough mines to lay a large field of these deadly engines off a hostile port. It is not surprising, therefore, that the Japanese experts should consider this to be an ideal type of submarine for their own navy. They are now reported to have evolved a slightly larger vessel based in all essential features on the U-125, but having a displacement of 1,250 to 1,400 tons and a speed of 16 knots. The armament is given as 1 5.5-inch and 1 12-pounder gun, 4 torpedo tubes and 50 mines. 2 submarines of this type were ordered in October 1920, and 4 similar boats are to be built in 1921. Since there is reason to believe that Japanese editions of other ex-German submarines have been designed, the following details of these vessels will be of interest. Submarine 03, displacement 715 tons, length 212 feet, speeds 17 knots on the surface, 9.5 knots submerged, cruising radius 9,500 sea miles, armament 1 4.1-inch and 1 3.4-inch quick-firing guns, 2 bow and 2 stern torpedo tubes. Submarine 02, displacement 725 tons, length 213 feet, speeds 15.5 knots on the surface, 9 3/4 knots submerged, cruising radius 11,250 sea miles, armament 1 4.1-inch quick-firing gun, 4 bow and 2 stern torpedo tubes. Submarines 06 and 07, displacement 516 tons, length 181 feet, speeds 14 knots on the surface, 8 knots submerged, cruising radius 9,000 sea miles, armament 1 4.1-inch quick-firing gun, 4 bow and 1 stern torpedo tubes. Mine-laying submarines 04 and 05, displacement 491 tons, length 184.5 feet, speeds 11.5 knots on surface, 6.5 knots submerged, cruising radius 9,850 sea miles, armament 1 4.1-inch quick-firing gun, 2 bow and 1 stern torpedo tubes. Of submarine number 55, which has been described as an improved type of cruiser submersible, the following details are to hand. Displacement 2,300 tons, length overall 330 feet, greatest breadth 34 feet, speeds 17 knots on surface, 8.5 to 9 knots submerged, cruising radius 16,000 miles at an economical speed of 7 knots. Armament 2 5.5-inch or 6-inch quick-firing guns, 4 bow and 2 stern torpedo tubes. The conning tower and upper deck are to be plated with armour. Each of these vessels will carry a complement of not less than 100 officers and men. The future submarine policy of Japan will be directed towards the creation of 2 distinct types. 1. Very large ocean-going cruisers of good speed, armed with 2 or more heavy quick-firing guns and at least 6 torpedo tubes. A certain proportion of these vessels will be mine-layers. 2. Smaller ocean-going vessels averaging 1,000 tons in displacement, of moderate speed, armed with 2 medium quick-firing guns and 4 or more torpedo tubes. In this case also, a fair proportion will be equipped for mine-laying duties. The purely coastal type will not be perpetuated, for experience has shown that it is a false economy to construct diminutive submarines when the addition of a couple of 100 tons in displacement endows a boat with good seagoing qualities and a far higher degree of all-round fighting value. That Japan will slavishly follow the German model in any of these types is not to be expected. It has been made clear that her constructors have original ideas on the subject, and that they have already succeeded in evolving a particular type of submarine which conforms to the special requirements of Japanese naval strategy. At a very conservative estimate, the present establishment numbers 107 submarines of all types, built, building, or on order. Of this total, all but 15 are ocean-going boats, and the large majority, having been designed since the war, may be regarded as incorporating the features which war experience has shown to be most desirable. It is the reputed intention of the present Minister of Marine, Admiral To, to secure legislative authority for enlarging the submarine fleet to 150 units, this total to be achieved not later than 1925. It is doubtful, however, whether Japan is either financially or technically in a position to execute a program of such dimensions within the period stated. Owing to the large increase in dimensions, submarines can no longer be produced in shoals at short notice. Even Germany found it impossible to build boats of medium size in less than 20 months, while the larger types took from 2 to 3 years to complete. Nor is it by any means certain that Japanese industry is capable of manufacturing in large quantities the propelling machinery, internal combustion and electric, of submarines. As noted in a previous chapter, submarine oil engines are built at the government dockyards of Kure and Sasebo and by 5 private firms, yet in 1919 the annual output was limited to 12 complete sets, only 4 of which were powerful enough to be fitted in large ocean-going boats. Footnote: orders for several sets of engines for Japanese submarines were placed with a British firm in 1920. End of footnote. Several writers in the Japanese press have lately urged the government to revise its naval policy by curtailing the number of capital ships and devoting the funds and shipbuilding resources thus made available to the more rapid development of the submarine fleet. But the naval authorities do not favour this course. They believe, with the British Admiralty and the American Navy Department, that the capital ship is the first and most important element of sea power. Admiral Kato, speaking in the Diet on the 21st of December 1919, said,
"The more we study the lessons of the war, the stronger does our conviction grow that the last word in naval warfare rests with the big ship and the big gun."
This conviction, however, has not prevented Admiral Kato from strengthening the submarine arm to the full extent of his power. The Japanese submarine service is manned entirely on a voluntary basis. The conditions of entry for officers and ratings are much the same as in the British Navy. The officer in command of the service, a rear admiral, has his headquarters at Kure, where a large submarine station with barracks to accommodate 6,000 men is in the course of erection. There are secondary bases for the underwater fleet at Yokosuka, Sasebo, and Tokuyama Bay, and it is intended also to establish submarine depots at Ominato, situated in Awamori Bay on the south side of Tsugaru Straits, and at Takashiki in the Korean Straits. Until very recently, Japan had done little to develop aviation, either for civilian or military purposes, and although substantial progress has been made in the last 2 years, she does not yet possess a degree of air power commensurate with the dimensions of her naval and military forces. This is the more surprising, inasmuch as the Japanese have many of the attributes which make for good airmanship. At the close of 1919, a wealthy American who desired to remain anonymous sent a remittance of £18,000 to the Japanese government, with the request that it be devoted to the purchase of flying machines and the training of pilots, adding that, in his opinion, the Japanese had qualities which ought to make them the finest aviators in the world. This story, which was given great prominence in the newspapers, appears to be authentic, but the fact remains that only since the end of the Great War has the Japanese flying service begun to expand on a really large scale. The backward state of aviation is ascribed to the discouraging experience of pre-war years, when the machines purchased abroad for training purposes turned out to be so unreliable and dangerous, and led to so many fatal accidents that practically all the pioneer flying men were killed off. The Army Flying Corps did not come into existence till 1915, and remained for some time a mere branch of the Engineer Corps, but was later reorganised on an independent footing. The first large vote on behalf of military aviation was made in 1916, when a sum of £60,000 was appropriated by the Diet. In 1918, this body voted for a further sum of £154,000, and in the same year, the number of Army flying squadrons was increased to 6. From 1910 to 1920 inclusive, a total of £2,500,000 was appropriated for naval and military aviation. During 1918, Admiral Kato, the Minister of Marine, succeeded in passing a bill for the expansion of the Naval Air Service. It contained a provision for 140 new machines, all of which were to be completed by 1923. In this year, Mr. K. Yamashita, a well-known shipowner, donated a sum of £100,000 for the purchase of flying material from the United States and Europe. The first Japanese aviators were trained in France and Germany during 1909. Shortly after their return home, the government laid out an aerodrome at Tokorozawa in the Saitama prefecture. Large orders for material were then placed in France, Germany, and England, but the outbreak of war prevented the delivery of all but a few machines. Japan was thus thrown back on her own resources, a circumstance which eventually proved more of an advantage than otherwise by stimulating the domestic production of planes and engines. By 1918, a number of fairly successful types for Army and Navy use had been evolved. Shortly after the close of the war, a French air mission, consisting of several well-known military airmen, arrived in Japan to reorganize the military air service. They found the Japanese officers apt and eager pupils, while the government did everything possible to facilitate the work of the mission. The Naval Flying Corps was established in 1912, with headquarters at Opama, near Yokosuka. Other naval aerodromes have since been built, including one at Kasumagara, which, when finished, will be the largest flying ground in Japan. An aeronautical laboratory, primarily for naval use, was opened in 1918 at Tsukiji, near Tokyo. The bulk of the Navy's machines and motors are built at the Kure and Yokosuka dockyards, the latter yard specialising in the design of heavy flying boats, bombing machines, and torpedo planes. Experimental work goes on continuously, with native and foreign designs of every description. The material purchased abroad in 1920 is said to have included complete machines by Vickers, Short, Curtis, de Havilland, and Sopwith, together with Rolls-Royce, Hispano-Suiza, and American Liberty engines. Naval aviators receive their preliminary training on 90-horsepower biplanes, passing for more advanced instruction to the fast Farman, Short, and Kaiganshiki Scouts, the latter a very successful native production. The heaviest bombing machine used by the Navy is a flying boat of 790 horsepower. The 1920 type of torpedo plane built at Yokosuka has a total weight of 7,200 pounds and a useful load of 1,750 pounds. It carries a special short torpedo with a maximum range of 2,000 yards. Large numbers of these machines have been ordered. A few warships have been fitted with aeroplane launching platforms to take small scouting biplanes. These machines have a span of 24 feet, an overall length of 19.5 feet, and weigh 1,225 pounds, with a useful load of 225 pounds. They have a speed of 125 miles an hour and are very swift climbers. The only aircraft carrier at present in service is the Wakamiya, an old naval transport incapable of steaming more than 9 knots. She will soon be replaced by a new vessel specially designed for this purpose, and other ships of the same type are to be built under the current program. The policy of the Navy Department is to have 2 fast aircraft carriers attached to the battle fleet by 1924, one carrying a flight of torpedo planes, while the other will be equipped with machines for scouting and artillery observation. Besides the aerodromes at Opama and Kasumigara, other naval aviation stations exist at Kure, Sasebo, in Ise, and at Oihama. New aerodromes for naval use are to be built at Chinkai, Korea, at Tsushima Island, and at Formosa. Up to the present, no large airship has been built in Japan, nor have any vessels of this type been imported from abroad, though funds were appropriated in 1919 for one medium airship on the Zeppelin principle. Footnote: the contract for this airship has since been placed with Vickers Limited. It will be of the Scout type. End of footnote. The Navy, however, possesses from 10 to 15 small non-rigid airships, or blimps, which are used as anti-submarine scouts and for gunnery control work. These are of a standard type, 170 foot long, with a speed of 27 knots and a cruising endurance of 17 hours. The Naval Flying Corps in December 1920 included 270 officer pilots and 160 officers under training. The Corps, which is commanded by Rear Admiral S. Yamanouchi, has its headquarters at Opama, near Yokosuka, and consists of 3 squadrons. The 1st Squadron is based at Opama, the 2nd Squadron at Kure, and the 3rd Squadron is attached to the active battle fleet. The Army Flying Corps had in 1920 a total of 620 pilots, of whom 250 were not fully qualified. It controlled 9 aerodromes, several of which, being situated on or near the coast, would be available for naval purposes if required. The 2 largest aircraft factories are the government establishments at Kure and Yokosuka, but 3 private firms, the Mitsubishi Co., the Kawasaki Co., and the Akabane Co., have recently taken up the manufacture of aeroplanes and engines on a large scale. At least 6 other firms now build aeroplanes for the government, but without supplying the motors for them. It does not appear that the Japanese have succeeded as yet in producing aircraft engines equal to the best foreign designers. The naval manoeuvres of September 1919 were the first in which aircraft took part in considerable numbers. In the course of these operations, air raids were delivered against the coast, and the battle fleet was subjected to attack by torpedo planes, while airships and aeroplanes cooperated with the fleet as scouts and artillery observers. In contrast to the indifference displayed in earlier years, both government and people are now showing the keenest interest in aviation. Civilian flying, which was practically unknown in 1918, is making such remarkable strides that 10 aerodromes are now in operation by private companies, and the 3 aviation societies, as distinct from the Army and Navy associations, have a total membership in excess of 14,000. It is probable, therefore, that Japan, at no distant date, will take rank among the leading air powers of the world. The prevalence of very high winds, the sudden atmospheric variations due to the peculiar topography of the country, and the typhoons, which usually occur 9 or 10 times each year, all contribute to make flying difficult and hazardous in Japan, and none but the most experienced airmen are equal to such trying conditions. End of section 13. Section 14 of Sea-Power in the Pacific by Hector Charles Bywater. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Alister. Chapter 9a, Strategy in the Pacific, Part 1. That the rapid growth of Japanese naval power was the chief reason that impelled the United States government in 1919 to transfer the strongest half of its fleet to the Pacific is a fact which admits no dispute. Such a division of the naval forces had long been in contemplation. It had formed the subject of repeated representations from the communities on the Pacific coast, who dreaded what might happen to them in the event of war with Japan, before their own fleet could make the long and painful passage from the Atlantic Ocean via the Magellan Straits. Nevertheless, in spite of strong pressure from California and the other Pacific states, the naval authorities wisely refused to divide the fleet until 2 conditions had been fulfilled. First, the opening of the Panama Canal, and secondly, the completion of sufficient ships to make possible the formation of 2 distinct and well-balanced squadrons, each strong enough to hold its own against any prospective enemy pending the arrival of reinforcements. Both postulates had been met by the middle of 1919, owing to the large increase in the number of destroyers built under the emergency war programs, and the commissioning of several new battleships. In his report for that year, the Navy Secretary dealt at some length with the principles which had governed the new distribution of the fleet. The organisation, he explained, had been so carefully thought out that when, at stated periods, the 2 fleets are combined, not a single additional order will be necessary for all units of both divisions to act in concert. Arrangements had been made for a unified command to take effect in certain contingencies. Each fleet would be at all times within easy supporting distance of the other, and a junction could be effected before any enemy could deliver an attack in force against either coast.
By this means,
he added,
the Navy not only protects each of our long coastlines, but places a wall of steel round our ocean boundaries, and gives us a sense of security such as we have never before enjoyed.
The tactical problems that would arise when 2 fleets combined had all been anticipated, and provision made to deal with them. Vessels of every type, battleships, cruisers, scouts, destroyers, submarines, fuel ships, and auxiliaries, had been assigned in equal numbers of divisional units to each fleet, thus obviating confusion and doing away with the necessity for reorganisation whenever the 2 fleets come together. Difficult as it may seem to reconcile such a division of force with the root principles of strategy, the circumstances in this case are unusual enough to explain, if not to excuse, the violation of a fundamental law of sea power. The United States Navy has to guard 2 very long coastlines, each studded with cities and harbours of great commercial importance. Had the combined navy been stationed in the Pacific before the opening of the Panama Canal, it could not have arrived in the North Atlantic in time to save New York from attack by a hostile force from Europe, nor, had it been concentrated in the Atlantic, could it have reached the Pacific in time to protect San Francisco against attack by a hostile fleet from Asia. In the pre-canal era, therefore, the division of the fleet into 2 portions might have been justified on the grounds of expediency, provided always that each portion was not hopelessly inferior in strength to the forces which might be brought to bear against it. But the opening of the great Isthmian waterway produced a radical change in the strategical situation. There is no doubt whatever that the real motive which led the United States to embark upon this colossal enterprise was strategic rather than economic. It was undertaken to promote national safety first, and national prosperity second. There were, indeed, other weighty reasons which made it desirable to bring the two seaboards of the Union into closer touch, but first and foremost was the need of rapid intercommunication for purposes of defence. Americans retained a vivid recollection of the anxious days of 1898, when the imminence of war with Spain made it a matter of urgent necessity to concentrate every available fighting ship in the Caribbean Sea. At that time the battleship Oregon was lying at San Francisco. She was at once ordered to make for Cuba at her utmost speed, but it took her 68 days of steaming, part of the time under forced draft, to complete the voyage of 14,000 miles via the Straits of Magellan. Today, thanks to the Panama Canal, Cuba can be reached almost as quickly from San Francisco as from Europe.
The difference in time might mean the difference between victory and defeat, for the Oregon was a first-line ship in 1898, and took a leading part in the naval achievement at Santiago. If the enemy then had been stronger, it could and would have forced battle before the arrival of the Oregon. But with the open Isthmian Canal, the Atlantic and Pacific fleets could carry out the plans already formulated as one fleet before any enemy could try conclusions with us.
By using the canal, the two fleets could unite in either ocean within a fortnight, assuming that when the order came the Atlantic fleet was off the New England coast, and the Pacific fleet at San Francisco. It does not seem to have occurred to those responsible for the new scheme that this very proximity of the two fleets constitutes a potent argument against their separate existence. Despite all the careful arrangements which have been made to ensure cohesion and coordination when they unite, and become a single fleet, the experience of ages has taught us that no armed organisation can attain the highest level of efficiency until it has gone through a long course of training and manoeuvring under a single command. This is one drawback to the present scheme, but there are others. From the political point of view, the American Navy, when divided, does not possess the significance it would have as a united force. The Pacific Fleet, as now constituted, is inferior in strength to the combined Japanese Navy. It is not difficult to imagine the influence which this fact might exert in Japan, if political relations between the two powers were in a state of tension. Those Japanese spokesmen who favoured a settlement by force of arms might conceivably raise their voices in favour of delivering a sudden blow before the divided American fleet had time to coalesce. They might even urge the possibility of blocking the Panama Canal immediately before or after the formal declaration of war, thus delaying for 5 or 6 weeks the arrival of American reinforcements from the Atlantic, and incidentally throwing the entire American plan of campaign into utter confusion. No such encouragement to precipitate action would exist were the United States naval forces to be kept together as a single fleet of overwhelming strength, cruising alternately in both oceans. The moral effect of such a formidable concentration of power might prove an antidote to incipient war fever across the Pacific. Be that as it may, the division of the Navy is now an accomplished fact. Since the whole American scheme of naval strategy now pivot on the Panama Canal, the safety of that waterway in all circumstances may be described as the condition precedent to successful operations, whether offensive or defensive, against an Asiatic foe. It was the recognition of this truth which caused the United States government to insist on exercising entire political control over the canal zone, and determined it to lay down heavy fortifications at each end of the canal, contrary, it may be noted, to the Hay-Ponce-Foot Treaty. But Great Britain, for reasons which have never been publicly stated, raised no objection to this important modification of the treaty. As the late Admiral Mahan pointed out, the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty bound the United States to share control of an Isthmian canal with Great Britain. The two powers were to guarantee mutually the neutrality of any canal. But the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty subsequently gave place to the Hay-Ponce-Foot Agreement, which left the construction of the canal and the guarantee of its neutrality to the United States alone. Work on the canal began on the 4th of May 1904, and on the 15th of August 1914 the completed waterway was opened to the passage of vessels not requiring more than 30 feet of water. The total length of the canal from deep water in the Atlantic to deep water in the Pacific is 50 miles. The length on land is 41.5 miles. In making the passage from the Atlantic to the Pacific, a vessel first enters a channel in Limon Bay, follows this for a distance of 7 miles to Gatun, and there, entering a series of locks in 3 flights, is raised 85 feet to the level of Gatun Lake. Through this lake, the vessel can steam at full ocean speed, keeping to a channel which varies from 1,000 to 500 feet in width. On reaching Baz Obispo, 24 miles from Gatun, it passes through the Gayar Cut and steams through this defile for 6 miles to Pedro Miguel. There it enters a lock and is lowered 30 1/3 feet to a small lake at an elevation of 54 2/3 feet above sea level. Traversing this lake for about 1.5 miles to Miraflores, it enters 2 locks in series and is lowered to sea level, passing out into the Pacific through a channel about 8 1/4 miles in length, with a bottom width of 500 feet. The depth of the approach channel on the Atlantic side, where the tidal variation does not exceed 1.5 feet, is 41 feet at mean tide, and on the Pacific side, where the maximum variation is 23 feet, the depth is 45 feet at mean tide. The cost of building the canal was £75 million in round figures. This does not include the fortifications, on which, up to the present, a total sum of £7,382,000 has been expended. The defences of the canal fall under 3 headings. First, the building of heavy sea batteries at each ocean terminus. The second, the construction of field works in the vicinity of the locks, these works to be occupied by a mobile force of troops with a minimum strength of 7,000 men. Third, the maintenance of submarine flotillas at each terminus. On the Atlantic side, the principal sea defences are at Toro Point, on the west side of Colon Bay, whence a breakwater extends into the bay for a distance of 2 miles, and at Margarita Island, on the eastern side of the bay. The Pacific defences are built on 3 small islands, Flamenco, Perico, and Naos, situated in the Bay of Panama, about 3 miles from Balboa, and abreast the canal entrance. The original plan of fortification, which may have been modified since, provided for a composite armament of heavy long-range naval guns, large-caliber mortars, and medium quick-firing guns. The works on Margarita Island were to be armed with 2 14-inch and 2 6-inch guns, those at Toro Point with 2 14-inch guns, 2 6-inch guns, and 8 heavy mortars, and the battery at Manzanilla Point, City of Colon, with 2 or more 6-inch quick-firers. On the Pacific side, Flamenco, the outermost of the 3 islands, mounts a 16-inch naval gun with a range of 20,000 yards. Perico Island has 1 14-inch gun, and Naos Island 1 14-inch and 2 6-inch, besides some 12-inch mortars of a new and powerful type. In addition to these main defences, there are landward batteries of 6-inch quick-firers and mortars to protect the forts against attack from the land side, and mobile defence at each terminus of the canal is provided by flotillas of submarines. Some years ago, the General Board of the United States Navy issued a statement in reply to criticisms which had been passed on the scheme of canal defence. It expressed full confidence in the adequacy of the fortifications to safeguard the transfer of an American fleet from one ocean to the other, and explained that the function of the forts in this particular instance was precisely the same as it was at any fortified place from which a fleet might have to issue in the face of an enemy squadron. Guns mounted on shore are on an unsinkable and steady platform, where they can be provided with unlimited protection and accurate range-finding devices. Guns mounted on board ship are on a sinkable, unsteady platform. Their protection is necessarily limited, and methods of range-finding afloat cannot be brought to the same degree of perfection as on shore. The shore gun of equal power has therefore a great advantage over the gun mounted on shipboard, an advantage which is increased if the former can be mounted on disappearing carriages, as are the seacoast guns of the United States. The mere statement of these elementary facts is sufficient proof of the value of coastal batteries to assist a fleet in passing out from behind them to engage an enemy fleet outside, provided the shore guns are mounted in advance or abreast of the point at which the ship channel debouches into the open sea. Even if somewhat retired from that point, they would still be useful. but to a less extent. At the Pacific terminus of the canal there are outlying islands that afford ideal sites for fortifications, the usefulness of which in covering the egress of a fleet in the face of opposition is self-evident. As for the defences at the Atlantic terminus, the General Board stated that the conditions there were unusually favourable for the mounting of guns designed to cover the deployment of the fleet.
On both sides of Lamon Bay, in which the canal terminates at the Atlantic end, there are excellent sites for forts, well advanced on outlying points. The line joining these sites is 3,000 yards in front of the point where the canal prism reaches a low water depth sufficient for battleships, and Lamon Bay from this point outwards is wide enough for a formation of 8 ships abreast. The outer end of the most advanced breakwater is only 600 yards in front of the line joining the sites for the forts, and as long as the ships remain behind the breakwater, it will afford them a considerable amount of protection from the enemy's fire, while they will themselves be able to fire over it. In order to make his fire effective, the enemy must come within effective range of the guns in the batteries.
Some very interesting data relating to the defences at the Pacific end were given by General Weaver, US Army, in the course of his testimony before the Subcommittee on Appropriations for the Defence of the Canal. In his opinion, the defences there are wholly adequate. It was suggested to him that an enemy might mount guns on Tobago Island and thus, with the assistance of fire from the ships, control the water area in front of the Pacific terminus. General Weaver explained, however, that the new type of mortars that were being provided for the fortifications at Panama would have a range of 200,000 yards. Their fire would sweep the island and command the approach for a considerable distance beyond Tobago. In fact, ships lying 8,000 yards to the seaward of the island would be exposed to shells from the mortar batteries. Furthermore, the single 16-inch gun mounted on Flamenco would have a range of 20,000 yards, and the 14-inch guns on Perico and Naos ranges of 18,400 yards, while the heavy quickfirers on Naos and on the mainland could shoot to a distance of 6,000 yards, and were well placed to repel any attempt at landing on the fortified islands. Nor is the reliance placed on guns alone. Apart from the mobile defence by submarines, the waters on both sides lend themselves admirably to mine-laying. There are no swift currents and the water is not excessively deep. The narrowness of the approaches and the absence of fog makes range-finding and artillery plotting simple and accurate. The channels through which a hostile fleet would have to approach, being strictly defined, have been carefully plotted, with the result that an annihilating fire could be brought to bear on the ships before they came within effective bombarding distance. The danger of damage to the locks by sabotage on the part of enemy agents has not been overlooked. Colonel Goethals, under whose supervision the canal was built, was requested to state his views on this subject. His reply is worth quoting.
In order to accomplish the destruction of the locks, it would be necessary to place the charges very carefully in them. To do that would take time, and what would our sentries be doing in the interval? One man could not carry a sufficient quantity of explosive to destroy the locks. You would have to deposit the charge behind a gate, and in a certain place behind the gate, in order to disable the canal. And you must destroy the gate to destroy the canal. I cannot imagine what people operating the canal and the troops having charge of its defense would be doing in the meantime.
It is said that 9 detailed schemes for the invasion of England were submitted to Moltke, the great German strategist. After examining each one carefully, he returned them with the marginal note.
In theory, all are feasible. In practice, all would be impossible.
The same remark would probably apply to the many schemes which the Japanese naval authorities are popularly supposed to have worked out for the destruction of the Panama Canal locks. In recent years, war with the United States has furnished the theme of several highly coloured stories by Japanese writers, and in nearly every case the imaginary campaign opens with a sudden and devastating raid on the Panama Canal. While this does not necessarily mean that attempts against the canal, either by secret agents or a naval expedition, would certainly be made in the event of war, it does suggest that the subject has been well considered in Japan. Nor would this be surprising in view of the terrible handicap which even the temporary disablement of the canal would impose upon American naval command. But although something might be attempted in that direction, the chances are all against successful interference with the canal. The enormous difficulty of reducing even mediocre land fortifications by naval bombardment was demonstrated on many occasions during the Great War, and British experience at Gallipoli and off the Belgian coast went far to confirm Napoleon's dictum. Japanese strategists, having studied naval history to good purpose, would be not in the least likely to pit their best ships, and inferior vessels would be worse than useless, against the modern high-velocity guns and heavy mortars which guard the Panama Canal. There is, however, a yet weightier reason for dismissing a Japanese naval attack on Panama from the category of war possibilities. The coast of Japan is some 8,000 miles distant from Panama, and it would therefore be physically impossible for a Japanese squadron to attack the canal unless it had a base near at hand. This factor of distance dominates the whole question of Pacific strategy. As regards the prospects of damage to the canal locks by secret agents, it goes without saying that special vigilance would be exercised at the first hint of political tension. Moreover, the lock gates are ponderous affairs, which could only be put out of action by a party of blasting experts, equipped with all the necessary tools and a large quantity of explosives, and having plenty of time at their disposal. On the other hand, a temporary block might be created by the scuttling or blowing up of a large ship inside the locks, and no one who knows of the heroism displayed by Japanese sailors in previous wars could doubt their readiness to sacrifice themselves for the attainment of such a vital military advantage. Extreme vigilance on the part of the American authorities may minimize the danger to the canal in wartime, but cannot wholly eliminate it. And apart from enemy action, the possibility of a block occurring through landslides is ever present. War with Japan in the immediate future would confront the American Naval Command with a task of extraordinary complexity. They would be faced with the alternative of waging a purely defensive war, which, by entailing the loss of all possessions in the Western Pacific, would be tantamount to a confession of defeat, or of fighting under conditions so difficult that a decisive success would be practically impossible to achieve. A glance at a chart of the Pacific Ocean will suffice to corroborate this statement, assuming the student to be conversant with the defenceless condition of the American territories in the western area of that ocean. When the United States relieved Spain of the Philippines, she gave hostages to fortune in a sense which the American people have never fully realized. But for the acquisition of these islands, they need never have maintained a powerful fleet in the Pacific, or have gone to the expense of constructing great naval bases on the western coast. Their possession, however, at once advanced the frontiers of the United States nearly 7,000 miles across the Pacific, and made her an Asiatic power, thereby conferring upon her all the cares and responsibilities inseparable from that status. The Philippine archipelago, which was ceded by Spain to the United States under the Treaty of Peace concluded in April 1899, extends almost due north and south from Formosa to Borneo and the Moluccas. It embraces about 3,100 islands and islets, with a total area of 115,000 square miles. The two largest islands, Luzon and Mindanao, cover between them an area of some 77,000 square miles. The population in 1919 was estimated to be 9 million, of whom about 12,000, excluding troops, were Americans or Europeans. The great majority of the inhabitants are members of the Malayan race. Autonomous government was granted to the islands in 1916, with the exception of the Governor-General and the Vice-Governor, who are Americans. The heads of government departments are all Filipinos. In normal times, the islands are garrisoned by a force of 5,600 regular troops of the United States Army and from 8,000 to 9,000 native levies, known as the Philippine Scouts, under American officers. Legislation enacted in 1917 provided for the establishment of a militia in which every able-bodied male citizen of the islands, between the ages of 18 and 45, is liable to serve. Of the 3 naval bases in the Philippines, viz. Cavite, that is Manila, Olongapo, and Polloc, None is properly equipped for the repair and maintenance of ships. Cavite is to be
developed moderately.
according to the Naval Secretary's report from 1920, while the other two stations are ultimately to be abandoned. It will be seen, therefore, that nowhere in the archipelago does there exist a base capable of supplying the bare needs of a great fleet, nor, up to the end of 1920, were there any facilities for the storage of coal, oil, provisions or ammunition in the vast quantities required by a modern fleet. If the Pacific Fleet visited the Philippines, it would have to bring with it everything it needed in the way of fuel and stores, and once there, it must rely on its own repair ships to make good any damage or defects. There are no defences worth the name at Cavite. The old batteries erected by the Spaniards have never been reconstructed on modern principles, and, except for a few quick-firing guns, the station could offer no resistance to a hostile squadron. From time to time within the past 20 years, the fortification of Manila and other strategic points in the islands has been proposed, but nothing has yet been done. This omission is not due entirely to considerations of economy. The most experienced naval and military officers in the United States have advised against the building of costly fortifications at Manila and elsewhere on the ground that without the support of a powerful fleet, the archipelago, as a whole, could not be defended against invasion by a Japanese army, and, as has been shown, no facilities exist in the islands for even the temporary maintenance of such a fleet. A distinguished American naval officer has put the case very cogently.
The Philippines are there for Japan whenever she likes to take them, and nothing can prevent her from seizing them when she feels disposed to do so. As at present circumstanced, we could do nothing whatever to protect them in time of war. If we were foolish enough to locate a fleet at Manila, the history of Port Arthur would repeat itself, with us in the role of the Russians. An expeditionary force consisting of 18-knot transports guarded by a squadron of reasonable strength could leave the southern ports of Japan, reach Manila in 3 days, and make itself absolute master of Luzon, before succor could arrive from Hawaii, our nearest naval base, which is some 5,000 miles away. Consequently, when the rescuing fleet did turn up, it would find the Japanese flag waving over Manila, and itself, with depleted bunkers, forced to fight under the most disadvantageous conditions, or to beat an ignominious retreat without standing upon the order of its going. That is not a picture of what might happen, but of what most assuredly will happen if war breaks out within the next few years.
It is certain, at any rate, that the invasion of the Philippines would present no serious difficulty to Japan. Her southernmost naval bases are less than 1,300 to 1,750 miles distant from the islands. Excellent landing places abound both in Luzon and Mindanao. The shore defences are either insignificant or non-existent, and the small garrison of trained troops could offer only the feeblest resistance to a landing undertaken simultaneously at different points. The Philippines must therefore be guarded by naval force or not at all, and, as the lack of a well-found fleet base near at hand puts effective naval protection out of the question for the time being, the islands would, doubtless, fall an easy prey to Japan in case of war with the United States. Those who endeavour to investigate the strategical problems to which a conflict would give rise must experience a feeling of amazement at the failure of the United States to take the most elementary precautions against the loss of the Philippines. It has built up a huge battle fleet that will ultimately be second to none in strength, but it has taken no steps to avert a disaster which would shatter American prestige in the East, and leave the final issue of a war with Japan decidedly in doubt. An American naval officer has said with truth that
anyone really alive to the actual situation in our Pacific possessions must feel grave misgivings as to our future in that ocean. There is,
he continued,
one thought which we must dismiss from our minds, and that is that we are really ever going to allow anyone to tell us to get out of the Philippines, or that the moral and economic interests of the world at large will be otherwise than definitely set back by our doing so.
To do so voluntarily is sufficiently like the proposition of removing both hands from a sheet of flypaper to make it difficult to appear graceful in doing so.
End of section 14. Section 15 of Sea-Power in the Pacific by Hector Charles Bywater. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Alister. Chapter 9b, Strategy in the Pacific, Part 2. Before examining in more detail the problem of defending the Philippines, it will be fitting to take a broad survey of the strategical situation in the Pacific as it would appear on the eve of hostilities between the United States and Japan. As it would be improbable that the American government would have to reckon with complications from the side of Europe, the Naval Command would doubtless feel justified in withdrawing the bulk of its forces from the Atlantic, leaving only enough vessels to maintain an extended patrol of the eastern littoral. But at a moment when relations with Japan were becoming tense, Washington might hesitate to dispatch the Atlantic fleet to the Pacific, lest this measure, which would undoubtedly be interpreted in Japan as a direct threat of war, should precipitate the crisis. It is therefore by no means certain that the outbreak of war would find the whole American Navy concentrated in the Pacific, and several weeks might elapse ere the two fleets combined. Japan would know how to turn this delay to good account. Her own forces would be concentrated far more swiftly and secretly than would be possible in the case of her opponent. Assuming, however, that the entire United States battle fleet, with its ancillary squadrons, flotillas and train, was in the Pacific soon after the declaration of war, it is not easy to see what immediate action it could take against the enemy. So far as the defence of the American continental seaboard, and the less remote overseas possessions was concerned, its task would not be difficult. It is generally assumed that the main body of the fleet would at once move out to Hawaii, where it would be favourably placed for controlling the eastern area of the Pacific and covering the American coast from the Canadian border to Panama. Hawaii is approximately equidistant from California, Alaska and Samoa, and therefore may be said to flank the lines of approach from eastward to each and all of those places. Given a strong fleet based at Hawaii, and adequate naval stations in the Aleutian Islands off the Alaskan coast, and at Tutuila, Samoa, the whole of the eastern half of the Pacific Ocean should be susceptible of easy and effective control. Geographically, the strategical position of the United States in this ocean is remarkably good, not excepting the western area, as will shortly appear. But up to the present its possibilities have not been exploited. On this point, some recent remarks by Admiral Lieblack, USN, may be aptly quoted.
Geography has placed a large ocean on either side of us, between us and our powerful neighbors. Looking across the Atlantic, we have always accepted a defensive role, and talked and thought, and built to repel an enemy if he should come. This habit of thought, of waiting for something, of holding back, of expecting things to come to us, has almost destroyed our initiative. We have reasoned that our fleet would give us time to bring up our supposed reserves and enable us to raise an army of volunteers. Facing this comfortable solution, we have turned our back upon the Pacific. Geography, acquisitiveness, or destiny has presented us in the Pacific with Alaska, the Hawaiian Islands, Tutuila,
That is Samoa.
Midway Island and Guam, as stepping stones across the Pacific, and, by their possession, imposed upon us the same policy as if they were actually in the hands of an enemy or a rival, because they exist and cannot be sunk. And if we fail to make the right use of them, geography will turn them against us, just as it turned them away from others and to us. The Pacific permits to us no defensive policy, such as we have softened ourselves to in the Atlantic. Our coastline extends to Guam. Even if we should scuttle in the Philippines, we can wriggle and squirm and make a wry face over paying the bill, but we can never evade ultimately the cost of properly fortifying a naval base in the island of Guam, and in a lesser degree in the island of Tutuila, in the archipelago of Alaska, and on Midway Island, just as we have already begun good work in the Hawaiian Islands, and at Balboa at the Pacific end of the Panama Canal. The reason being, if there were no other, to prevent their being used against us as commercial supply stations, or naval bases, by an enterprising rival or enemy.
Lord Salisbury's advice to the British people touching the study of big maps is equally applicable to the American people of the present generation. Thanks mainly to the anti-Japanese agitation on the western coast, their attention has been drawn to the Pacific as a possible war area of the future. But their vision does not appear to have extended far enough. More harm than good has been done by the well-meant efforts of writers such as Homer Lee, whose sensational forecast of Japanese operations against the United States was so demonstrably absurd that it encouraged American public opinion to dismiss the whole subject as an idle scare. Every intelligent American knows that his home coasts are, humanly speaking, secure against invasion from the Far East. It is some 10 years since Homer Lee wrote his book, in which he described at great length the transport of a huge Japanese army across the Pacific, its landings in Washington, Oregon, and California, and its eventual conquest of the whole Pacific slope. Even at that date, the American Navy was quite strong enough to have made such an operation absolutely impossible, and since, in the interval, its position of relative strength vis-à-vis the Japanese Navy has substantially improved, there is less reason than ever to include an invasion of the American mainland among the possible events of a future war. But security against invasion is not everything. If Great Britain during the World War, while keeping her homeland inviolate, had nevertheless lost several of her most important overseas possessions, she would rightly have been judged the defeated party. Similarly, if the United States engaged in war with Japan, succeeded in protecting her continental seaboard and in keeping the whole of the Western Pacific free of enemy forces, but at the same time forfeited the Philippines and Guam, she would be judged the loser. Yet this is precisely the risk which the American people, consciously or otherwise, have been incurring for the last 20 years, and which they still incur. Their most distinguished strategists have told them time and again that they already have in the Pacific the finest strategical positions imaginable, which only require development to prevent war by making it too hopeless a business for any prospective enemy.
It is a game of checkers with our advantage against the whole world as far as positions go. It is clearly in our power to compel the strategy of the Pacific in time of peace, in such a way as to avoid the possibility of war.
For less than the cost of 2 modern battleships, such a chain of naval bases could be thrown across the Pacific as would give the American fleet entire command of the situation and enable it to wage a war both of offence and defence with the whole of its available resources. But for some inexplicable reason, no provision has been made by successive administrations for the rudimentary needs of the Navy in the event of war with an Asiatic power. The only insular position which has been turned to strategical use is that of Hawaii. Here, at Pearl Harbor, Oahu, some 12 miles from Honolulu, the capital, a naval base has long been in the process of gradual development. A large dry dock capable of taking warships of any dimension was opened in August 1919, and the dockyard is being extended and supplied with the plant necessary to deal with heavy repairs. At the present time, however, Pearl Harbor is not equal to the task of maintaining a great fleet, nor is it likely to be in that position for several years to come. The program includes the building of fortifications armed with 14-inch guns and heavy mortars, which would be powerful enough to secure it against attack from any quarter, but it is doubtful whether this armament has yet been mounted. Although Hawaii has been American property since 1898, it is only within the last 10 or 12 years that its great strategical value has been recognized. To many Americans, it is a fact of sinister import that so large a percentage of the population of Hawaii should consist of Japanese immigrants. In June 1919, the total population of the islands was estimated at 250,000, of whom no fewer than 110,000 were Japanese. Since many of the latter are males of military age, it has been suggested that, in the event of war, they would at once rise in a body and make themselves masters of the island. But while this contingency need not be dismissed as wholly fantastic, it is certain that the possession of Hawaii would be determined in the long run by sea power, and so long as the American Navy remains supreme in the Eastern Pacific, Hawaii could not be held by an enemy. It has been shown that a strong fleet based upon Pearl Harbor would be favourably situated for defending the Pacific coast, as well as the overseas territories in Alaska and Samoa. On the other hand, it could not extend protection to the Philippines, which lie nearly 5,000 miles to the westward of Hawaii. In these circumstances, there can be no serious doubt at the course that Japanese strategy would take. Whether or no Japan really covets the Philippines for their own sake is a question irrelevant to the present issue, but it is certain that they would provide her with an irresistible opportunity of dealing a smashing blow at the United States. But for one factor, the fate of the Philippines, in the event of an Americo-Japanese conflict, would be a foregone conclusion. That factor is Guam, a position which has rightly been described as unique, commanding, and of supreme importance, the veritable key of the Pacific. The small island, sometimes referred to as Guahan, is the southernmost and principal unit, in point of size, of the Marianne or Ladrone archipelago. It was ceded by Spain to the United States under the Treaty of Paris, concluded in December 1898, since when it has been under the jurisdiction of the American Navy Department. The governor is a naval officer appointed by the President. The system of administration is predominantly naval in character. The garrison consists of Marines, and the port is not open to foreign vessels of war or commerce, except in special cases. This circumstance shows clearly enough that the unique strategical value of the island has always been appreciated by the United States naval authorities, and suggests that if purely naval councils had prevailed, Guam would long since have been developed on a scale commensurate with its importance. The island is 32 miles long, varying in breadth from 4 to 10 miles, the circumference being about 100 miles, and the total area 228 square miles. The anchorage in Apra Harbour is 8 miles from Agana, the capital. It is approached by a channel through the coral reefs, and is spacious enough to accommodate a large fleet at the cost of moderate dredging. During the Spanish regime, it was defended by 2 old masonry forts, now, of course, quite obsolete, but surveys undertaken by the American naval authorities have shown the anchorage to be capable of easy defence by modern methods. According to a plan submitted in 1905, Guam could have been made virtually impregnable for an outlay of £1,500,000 sterling, which included the erection of shore batteries and the laying of minefields and other obstructions. Nevertheless, no steps have been taken to carry out such work, and the island remains, to the present date, a mere coaling station, without any adequate defences and with no facilities for the upkeep of a naval squadron. To say that Guam bears to the Philippines the same relation that Heligoland bore to the German Bight, or that Malta bears to the defence of British interests in the Mediterranean, would be to understate rather than exaggerate the facts of this case. By properly fortifying and developing this island as a naval station of the first rank, the American people would do much to relieve themselves of anxiety as to their future in the Western Pacific, for no power would venture to molest the Philippines, while a strong American fleet in being was based at Guam, only 1,500 miles away. On the other hand, lacking the fortifications, docks, magazines, and other appurtenances of a great naval base, the island would not only be useless as a point d'appui, but must fall into enemy hands. The fate of the Philippines is thus indissolubly connected with that of Guam. We may indeed go further and say that the issue of an Americo-Japanese war would be primarily decided by the fate of Guam. The American government has at length awakened, none too soon, to the supreme importance of this lonely outpost in the Pacific. In the Naval Secretary's report for 1920, the following announcement appears.
The project for the development of Guam as a naval base, in accordance with the announced policy of the Navy Department, is progressing. The detailed plans and recommendations are being prepared. These will be in accordance with the approved naval plans for national defense, and will be made the basis for recommendations as to appropriations.
Provided these recommendations are accepted by Congress, that necessary funds are promptly voted, and that no political complications intervene before the work is finished, Guam, a few years hence, will doubtless have become a first-class naval station, in which case the whole strategical outlook will have altered to the advantage of the United States. Meanwhile, however, the development scheme has not advanced beyond the paper stage, and in view of the attitude of Congress towards previous recommendations for naval works in the Pacific, the rejection or postponement of the Navy Department's plans on behalf of Guam would cause no surprise. One thing may be regarded as certain, namely, that if a serious crisis arose before Guam had been furnished with proper defences, dockyard plant, and naval magazines, it would be too late to make good the deficiency. There is convincing evidence that the Japanese are fully alive to the significance of the island, and are not disposed to remain passive while America makes a belated attempt to repair her long neglect of this magnificent strategical position. The majority of the European delegates at the peace conference were mildly surprised at the emphasis with which the Japanese envoys urged their country's claim to become the mandatory of the former German territories north of the equator. It is doubtful whether even President Wilson and his staff at Versailles realized to what they were committing themselves when, after some hesitation it is true, they acquiesced in the clauses which confirmed Japan in the possession of the Caroline, Palau, and Marianne Islands, excepting Guam, and of the Marshall Islands. The effect of this arrangement has been to surround Guam with a cordon of potential Japanese strongholds and naval bases. Japan, as the mandatory of the islands, is not entitled to fortify them, but that she would forego the use of such invaluable bases in case of emergency is not to be believed. Hostile submarines working from the base at Saipan Island in the Marianne Group would be within a few hours' sail of Guam. A few hundred miles to the southwest lies Yap, the administrative centre of the archipelago. This place was formerly the German wireless centre in the Palau Group, the other stations being at Nauru and Angar. The Yap wireless station, with its 200-foot steel trellis mast and its oil depot, was bombarded and destroyed by HMS Minotaur on April 12, 1914. In the following October, Yap was taken possession of by the Japanese 2nd South Sea Squadron. The island is admirably adapted for use as a base for submarines or other vessels operating against the Guam-Manila line of communications, and so long as it remained in enemy occupation, this route would never be safe. Even if she were driven out of Yap, Japan would still have the Palau Islands, west of the Carolines, with a good harbour at Angar, where in September 1914 the Emden called preparatory to making her famous raid into the Indian Ocean. Some 14,000 miles east of Guam lie the Marshall Islands, which came into prominence during the World War as one of the bases used by the German cruiser squadron under Admiral von Spee. He coaled at Brown Atoll and Eniwetok, subsequently moving to Majuro in the same group, from which place the German raiders Cormoran and Prinz Eitel Friedrich left to prey upon the shipping in Australasian waters. When the Marshall Islands were in German ownership, the beginnings of a naval base had been made at Jalowit. Since the Japanese occupation, this base is said to have been further developed, and there is now a depot for the storage of coal and oil. Similar reports have been heard in connection with Yap, Angar in the Palaus, Pulap and Ponape in the Carolines. Notwithstanding that the military government installed upon the first Japanese seizure of these islands has since been replaced by a civil administration, they are regarded primarily as military ports, and very little information concerning the works in progress there is allowed to leak out. Reports from American sources early in 1920 to the effect that naval works and fortifications were then being built at Jaluyit, Truk, Angar, Yap and Saipan were categorically denied in Japan. On the other hand, the Tokyo press has more than once intimated that the fortification of Guam by the Americans would leave Japan no option but to take similar measures in Saipan, Yap, and other strategic points in the South Sea Islands, in order to maintain the local balance of power. How this argument could be reconciled with the obligations entailed by the acceptance of the mandate was not explained. Without in any way impugning the good faith of Japan, it may be accepted as certain that these newly acquired territories will henceforth occupy a most important place in her scheme of naval strategy. They cannot, therefore, be ignored in relation to Guam, which is destined to become the principal American war station in the Western Pacific. That their proximity tends to reduce the value of this base is self-evident. Scapa Flow during the World War would have lost a great deal of its value, as the chief anchorage of the Grand Fleet had the Germans possessed submarine stations in the Shetlands. Yet a reference to the map will show that an American fleet at Guam would be in no less precarious a situation. Much depends, of course, on the extent to which this island base is to be developed. The building of strong seaward fortifications, the construction of a commodious artificial harbour in place of the present exposed anchorage, to be approached through a channel capable of being effectively closed against submarines, the establishment of an aviation centre with adequate provision of airships and aeroplanes, the installation of listening devices. These and other improvements would go far towards making Guam reasonably secure as a naval headquarters, in spite of the nearness of potential enemy bases. There is, however, yet another factor which the Americans will have to take into consideration when framing their plans as to the future of Guam. Before the American regime, this island was self-supporting in regard to food. The crops of maize, rice, sweet potatoes, sugar, etc. were ample for all local needs, and a surplus remained over for export. During the last 20 years, however, agriculture has sensibly declined. The native Chamorro found it more profitable to work on the government roads, with the result that his farm was neglected, and the crops soon fell below the minimum necessary to feed the island population. But for the supplies which now reached them every month from the United States, the 13,000 natives could not subsist, and if this inflow of food were interrupted, a most serious situation would ensue. No survey of American base power in the Pacific would be complete without some mention of the Aleutian Islands, Midway Island, Wake Island, and Tutuila. The need of a fortified base in the Aleutian group, preferably at Dutch Harbour, Unalaska, has long been urged by American naval officers. Alaska has been termed the storehouse of the future. It is exceedingly rich in mineral resources, though at present the major proportion of its revenue is derived from the fisheries. In 1918, this industry alone employed 31,000 persons, 640 steam vessels, and 7,600 smaller craft, the total value of the fish products in that year amounting to £12 million. The exposed position of the Aleutian Islands, barely 2,000 miles from the northern ports of Japan, would render them liable to destructive cruiser and submarine raids if no American naval force was based near at hand. It is true that a fleet operating from Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, could probably secure the islands and the Alaskan coast from serious invasion, but it would not be able to protect them against lightning raids. The only existing naval station in Alaska is at Sitka, which was established in 1867, but, except for a small stock of steam coal, it has no facilities of any kind, and is without defences. Midway, or Brook Island, is a small island situated 1,126 miles to the northwest of Pearl Harbor, conveniently near the Hawaii-Guam route. It is now a cable relay station. At present, no ships drawing more than 17 feet of water can cross the bar. At an estimated cost of £1 million, however, Midway could be transformed into a fortified auxiliary base which would lengthen the westward reach of a fleet working from Pearl Harbor by several thousand miles. Of considerably greater importance is Wake Island, which lies 1,300 miles east of the Marianne Group on the direct route between Hawaii, Guam, and Manila. The conversion of Wake Island into a well-defended fueling station would materially assist in consolidating this vital line of communication. The island of Tutuila, Samoa, is the only American possession in the southern Pacific. It is 2,300 miles distant from Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The naval station is at Pago Pago, the only good harbour in Samoa. It is approached by a rocky channel, the depth of water being great enough to allow vessels of the largest dimensions to come alongside the wharves. Plans were drafted in 1900 for the construction of a dockyard at Pago Pago, and a tract of land was purchased for this object, But the scheme was not put into execution, and there are consequently very limited means of repairing and supplying naval vessels at this port. It possesses a high-power wireless station, which enables communication to be maintained with the United States. The enormous expanse of the Pacific makes base power and large steaming radius the dominating factors in the strategical problems of that ocean. Without a chain of well-defended fuel stations, it would be impossible for the American fleet to operate for any length of time in the Western Pacific. An estimate of the fuel supplies required by a large fleet making the trans-Pacific voyage was prepared 5 years ago by an American naval officer, and while this requires modification in view of subsequent additions to the number of colliers and tankers and of the increased proportion of oil now consumed by American warships, it will serve to illustrate the difficulties of maintaining a great naval force in the Pacific, even in times of peace. The hypothesis was that a fleet consisting of 30 battleships, 20 of the largest cruisers, 40 destroyers, 20 colliers, 3 supply ships, and the fleet repair ship Vestal had assembled off Panama to make a leisurely voyage to Manila and back by way of Honolulu, Midway, and Guam. To reduce the problem of supplying this fleet to its simplest form, the cruising speed for the voyage was limited to 10 knots, and practically no allowance was made in the timetable for delays due to bad weather, engineering defects, or the need of overhauling machinery. As the distance from Panama to Honolulu is 4,685 miles, a non-stop run between these ports would necessitate the towing of certain ships, which had a small coal capacity, and it was proposed therefore to break the journey at Magdalena Bay, a deviation of only 125 miles from the direct route. The fleet would sail from Panama with bunkers and oil tanks filled to the utmost capacity. It was assumed that the aggregate consumption of fuel by the battleships, cruisers and destroyers when at sea, steaming 10 knots, would work out at 18 tons of coal and 3.5 tons of oil per mile, while their daily consumption in port was reckoned at 1,000 tons of coal and 160 tons of oil. As for the colliers and other auxiliaries, each of these vessels would burn 1/6 of a ton of coal, or 1/8 of a ton of oil, per mile at sea, or 12 tons of coal, 10 tons of oil, in port per day. The American battleships carry a supply of fresh provisions sufficient for 40 days, and dry provisions for 5 months. And for the hypothetical cruise now being discussed, it was arranged that the refrigerator ships Culgoa, Glacier, and Celtic should be emptied by the time they reached Guam, whence they were to proceed to Sydney, Australia, 3,000 miles, to take a fresh cargo, returning to Guam to meet the fleet on its homeward voyage. For the outward voyage, Panama to Manila, the consumption of fuel was estimated as follows. Table ends approximately 29 minutes and 18 seconds. Panama to Magdalena Bay. Sea miles, 2,265. Coal tons, 49,000. Oil tons, 8,500. In port 5 days. Coal tons, 5,000. Oil tons, 800. Magdalena to Honolulu. Sea miles, 2,543. Coal tons, 55,000. Oil tons, 9,500. In port 5 days. Coal tons, 5,000. Oil tons, 800. Honolulu to Guam via Midway. Sea miles, 3,450. Coal tons, 74,700. Oil tons, 13,000. In port 10 days. Coal tons, 10,000. Oil tons, 1,600. Guam to Manila. Sea miles, 1,542. Coal tons, 33,500. Oil tons, 5,800. In port 10 days. Coal tons, 10,000. Oil tons, 1,600. Sea miles, 9,800. Coal tons, 242,200. Oil tons, 41,600. End of table. By adding the total bunker capacity of all the ships in this fleet, the total coal and oil carrying capacity of the 20 fuel ships accompanying it, and comparing the aggregate figure with the estimated consumption of fuel as shown in the table above, we obtain the following data. Table ends approximately 30 minutes and 21 seconds. In bunkers, coal tons, 129,000, oil tons, 16,900. As cargo, coal tons, 120,000, oil tons, 28,100. Total coal tons, 249,000, oil tons, 45,000. Consumed as per table, coal tons, 242,200, oil tons, 41,600. Margin of fuel remaining on arrival at Manila, coal tons, 6,800, oil tons, 3,400. End of table. As the surplus remaining over would be negligible, the Commander-in-Chief would have to solve the problem of obtaining the 240,000 tons of coal and the 40,000 tons of oil needed to carry his fleet back to Panama. Singapore and the Australian ports would be the nearest sources of supply for bunker coal, but it is unlikely that they would have on hand an adequate supply of the best steam coal, which is required for naval use. It will be seen, therefore, that even in time of peace great difficulties would attend the fueling of a large fleet that crossed the Pacific. In time of war, the problem would, of course, be infinitely more complicated. For one thing, a cruising speed of 10 knots would be out of the question, especially when the fleet had left Hawaii and thus come within the radius of Japanese submarines. It would, on the contrary, have to pursue a zigzag course at a minimum speed of 16 knots, and would therefore reach Guam, with bunkers heavily depleted. Since none of the American fleet colliers has a speed higher than 14 knots, these vessels could not accompany the fleet on its westward voyage without endangering the whole force. Everything would depend, therefore, on the adequacy of the fuel stocks at the intermediate stations, such as Midway, and Wake Island, and at Guam itself. The capture of one of these bases by the enemy, or even the temporary exhaustion of its coal and oil reserves, might well have disastrous results for the fleet. While the Navy Department has very wisely built a number of large colliers and tankers for the exclusive use of the Navy, there are not nearly enough of these vessels to provide for the needs of a large force operating at a great distance from its main bases. Many more would have to be chartered, and in fact, it is understood that an agreement exists between the Navy Department and the United States Shipping Board, under which the latter has earmarked the best of its coal and oil carriers for naval use in times of emergency. But if experience in the World War counts for anything, the losses among these vessels would be enormous. During that conflict, no less than 244 colliers and 44 oil tankers in the service of the British Admiralty were sunk, mainly by enemy action, the losses in both types of craft amounting in the aggregate to close upon 1 million tons gross. Ships of this type are peculiarly vulnerable to submarine attack owing to their great length and low speed. So serious were the casualties suffered that the reserve of oil fuel for the British fleet was gradually reduced to an 8-week supply, and at one time it actually became necessary to issue orders that the speed of oil-burning warships was to be limited except in cases of extreme urgency. The bulk of these losses were suffered during the comparatively short voyage from the eastern ports of the United States to Europe, and 90% of them in the so-called danger zone, that is a few hundred miles from the English coast in an area which was closely patrolled. In the great wastes of the Pacific, where many of the most effective anti-submarine devices could not be used on account of the abnormal depth of the water and the immense distances involved, the submarine menace to slow-steaming vessels would be proportionately intensified. But torpedo attack would not be the only danger. Guam, Midway, Wake Island, and even Pearl Harbor itself, lying well within the radius of large ocean-going submersibles, starting from a point in the Caroline or Marshall Islands, would offer fruitful fields of activity to submarine mine layers, which, as we have seen, are a type to the development of which Japan is paying marked attention. Nor would it be possible to guarantee any of these bases against the attentions of surface mine layers. The British line of patrols strung across the northern exit from the North Sea could not prevent the German auxiliary cruiser Berlin from stealing out to lay off the Irish coast the mines which sank the Audacious. Other surface mine-carrying ships, notably the Mauve and Wolf, which contrived to pierce the blockading cordon jettisoned their deadly cargo in such remote waters as those of Cape Agulhas, the Gulf of Aden, and the Bay of Bengal. The Americans would therefore find it necessary to maintain a squadron of minesweepers at Pearl Harbor and every other base to the westward of that point. Japanese auxiliaries, of great steaming endurance, might even lay mines in the Gulf of Panama, thereby endangering vessels on their way, via the canal, to join the forces in the Pacific. Enough has been said to indicate the most serious difficulties which would handicap American naval operations in the Western Pacific. Japan, on the other hand, occupies a strategic position of unique advantage. Even before the acquisition of the South Sea Islands, she was virtually impregnable to attack by the United States, and could, at the same time, have reckoned with confidence on seizing the Philippines in the event of war. By taking over the former German insular possessions, she has now established herself on the flank of the only line of communication open to America, thus securing a strategical advantage of capital importance. Her own coasts are secured against aggression by a chain of naval stations extending from the Kurils to Formosa. The multitude of her harbours would make an effective blockade no easy matter, even for a powerful fleet based on the Philippines and Guam. If, however, the Philippines came into the possession of Japan, and she was able to hold them, the possibility either of blockade or of serious interference with her shipping would altogether vanish. Since the United States is without a foothold on Chinese territory, Japan would have no reason to fear attack from the western side. Owing to the narrowness of the Korean Straits, the closing of the Sea of Japan to enemy vessels would be a simple matter. From Fusan in Korea to Shimonoseki is a distance of only 120 miles, and midway between the two coasts stands the island of Tsushima, like a sentinel guarding the passage. La Perouse Strait, the northern entrance to the Sea of Japan, which is less than 40 miles wide and is flanked on either side by Japanese territory. Sakhalin in the north and the Hokkaido coast on the south could be barred with equal facility. Since the time of the Russian War, the Japanese have modernized and strengthened their coastal fortifications at considerable expense. They had previously been armed with Cannae and Armstrong guns, from 9-inch to 12-inch caliber, on disappearing mountings, and in some cases with howitzers as well. At the present time, the principal sea forts, such as those at Tokyo Bay, Maizuru, Nagasaki, Hiroshima, Shimonoseki, Hakodate, and Tsushima Island, are furnished with modern guns of heavy caliber and great range. Additional protection is afforded by large torpedo flotillas, minefields, and aircraft. The efficacy of the coast defences in the southern portion of Japan was tested during the manoeuvres of 1919, when repeated attempts at bombardment and landing were adjudged to have been repelled with heavy loss to the assailants. Furthermore, by means of an excellent system of railway communication, large bodies of troops could be moved with great rapidity to any threatened point along the coast. A study of the Japanese railway map suggests that the system has been planned with more than a casual view to strategic requirements. On Honshu, the main island, every part of the coast excepting a short stretch in the Wakayama district is served by the railway. Experiments have been made recently with heavy guns mounted on railway trucks for the purpose of mobile coast defence, and it is possible that this method, which has many advantages over fixed batteries, besides being far more economical, will be greatly expanded in the future. The only portion of the Japanese Empire which from its geographical position is exposed to successful attack is the island of Formosa, or Taiwan, which was ceded by China in 1895. Its food and mineral products make Formosa an asset of value to Japan, who imports nearly 1/5 of the annual rice crop and also obtains large quantities of coal and copper from the same source. Extensive oil fields are believed to exist on the island, but up to the present the yield has been limited. Situated only 500 miles north of Manila, Formosa is nearer to the Philippines than to Japan, and might therefore be successfully attacked by a joint naval and military expedition, provided the American fleet had command of the sea in that area. There are, however, few good harbours in Formosa, and all of these are fortified. The permanent Japanese garrison consists of several thousand troops. Formosa would undoubtedly be useful as a base for offensive operations against the Japanese coast and seaborne trade, but for the reasons stated, its reduction by an American force need not be reckoned among the probabilities of a conflict in the Pacific. End of section 15. Section 16 of Sea-Power in the Pacific by Hector Charles Bywater. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Alister. Chapter 10. Possible Features of a War in the Pacific. If naval power were measured by battleships alone, the American people would have little cause for anxiety as to their future in the Pacific. When the programs now in hand on both sides of the ocean are completed, the United States will have about twice as many capital ships as Japan. But as we have seen, many other factors must be taken into consideration. In the event of war with Japan, the United States would at once be called upon to decide whether its distant insular possessions were to be defended or abandoned. In the latter case, the strategical problem would be reduced to a simple form, and the United States Navy would be entirely adequate to fulfill the duties which would then devolve upon it. But if the passive surrender of the Philippines and Guam were held to be incompatible with the interest and prestige of the nation, a very different situation would arise, and since neither the history nor traditions of the American people lead us to suppose they would tolerate so monstrous a humiliation, it is safe to assume that the retention of the islands at all costs would be determined upon as a matter of course. That decision would necessitate the dispatch of large naval and military forces to the threatened territory across many thousands of miles of ocean. Whether the American fleet could straightaway proceed to the war zone would depend on what was meanwhile taking place in the Philippines and at Guam, but more especially at the latter point. If war broke out before anything had been done to convert Guam into a strong place of arms, it might and probably would fall into enemy hands in the first weeks of the war, for it would pay the Japanese to devote all their efforts to capturing this island before attempting any move against the Philippines. With Guam in their possession, they could take the Philippines at their leisure, in certainty that no one could interfere with them. It is reasonable to infer from their conduct on previous occasions that the Japanese would act with swiftness and energy once a rupture had become inevitable. In 1894, a Japanese naval squadron began hostilities against China a week in advance of the formal declaration of war, and the famous torpedo attack at Port Arthur in February 1904 took place only a few hours after the Japanese government had signified its resolve to terminate the negotiations with Russia. Once the Japanese had determined to take up arms, they would carry on their preparations behind an impenetrable veil of secrecy. Long before the World War came to make us familiar with the meaning of a military censorship, Japan had brought the suppression of war news to a fine art. During both the Sino-Japanese and the Russo-Japanese campaigns, not a word of news leaked out of Japan which did not carry the official censor's imprimatur. Although the Russians maintained an army of agents in Japan to keep them informed of naval and military movements, they received no trustworthy intelligence from these sources. The Japanese fleet concentrated at Sasebo had left that port for its war base at Mokpo on the southwest coast of Korea, without a soul outside Japan being any the wiser. Subsequent movements of the Navy and Army throughout the war were shrouded in the same secrecy. Divisions were assembled at points of embarkation, transported across the Sea of Japan, and had reached the front before it was known that they were under orders to leave. If the hypothetical conflict we are now discoursing began in 1922, the Japanese Navy would dispose of 7 dreadnoughts, 4 battlecruisers, a large number of older armoured ships, 12 fast light cruisers, more than 100 destroyers, and about 60 seagoing submarines. This force could not hope to fight a successful action with the entire American battle fleet, which would have more than twice as many heavy ships and destroyers, but it would be quite strong enough to overpower and annihilate the American cruiser squadron stationed at Manila, and to cover the landing of expeditionary forces in the Philippines and at Guam. The broadside fire of 7 dreadnoughts alone would be more than sufficient to sweep away the feeble defences at Manila and Guam. Minefields and any other obstructions which might be laid down in the fairways could be quickly removed by the sweepers and auxiliaries accompanying the Japanese fleet. By requisitioning the passenger and larger cargo steamers in Japanese ports at any average moment, tonnage for the transport of 100,000 troops with artillery and train could be provided at the shortest notice. The transport section of the Tokyo War Office has made the most detailed arrangements for the transportation overseas of large military contingents. It has been estimated by competent military observers that 8 divisions could be landed on any coast within 1,500 miles of Japan in 14 days from the date of mobilization. Embarkation and landing exercises have been frequently carried out in connection with military maneuvers during the past 10 years, and the operation is therefore one with which the Japanese Army is familiar. It is desirable at this point to review very briefly the strength and organisation of the Imperial Army, whose prowess in the War of 1904-5 against Russia earned it the right to be considered one of the finest and most formidable instruments of war in existence. Its rapid growth after the Chinese War of 1894-5 is shown by the following table, compiled by Marshal Prince Yamagata. Table ends at about 7 minutes and 4 seconds. Marshals and Generals. Before the Chinese War, 36. Before the Russian War, 94. After the Russian War, 125. Other officers. Before the Chinese War, 4,235. Before the Russian War, 8,480. After the Russian War, 14,388. Non-commissioned officers. Before the Chinese War, 8,770. Before the Russian War, 11,865. After the Russian War, 24,066. Men, before the Chinese War, 65,241. Before the Russian War, 132,348. After the Russian War, 211,396. Total, before the Chinese War, 78,482. Before the Russian War, 152,787. After the Russian War, 249,975. End of table. In the 1919 through 1920 session of the Diet, the War Minister, General Tanaka, on being pressed to disclose the peace strength of the army at that date, gave the following figures. Officers, 16,045. Non-commissioned officers, 28,369. Privates, 228,317. A total of 272,731. Like the sister service, however, the Army has not by any means reached the maximum standard of strength to which the government is determined that it shall ultimately attain. Their programme calls for an establishment of 41 Army Corps with a total of 1 million bayonets, with corresponding additions to the artillery and other branches. It is hoped to have, by 1930, not less than 740,000 troops in the first line, 780,000 troops in the second line, and 3,850,000 in the reserves. This is not an abnormal figure in relation to the Japanese population, but whether the national finances will ever permit it to be realised is open to doubt. The Prussian army is the master pattern on which Japan's military system has been fashioned, and the broad principles of organisation and training laid down by General Meckel, the Prussian officer who was appointed the military advisor to the Japanese government in 1885, have never been departed from. Beginning in 1918, however, a number of important reforms were introduced to embody the teachings of modern warfare. The army is to be entirely remodelled, and the process, according to General Tanaka, will not be completed before 1936, though it is believed that this period will in fact be greatly abbreviated. One of the first changes to be approved was the constitution of each division on a 3-regiment basis and the abolition of the brigade. An army corps will in future comprise 2 divisions, or 6 regiments. This arrangement will shortly result in an establishment of 32 divisions, or 6 army corps, exclusive of the Guards Division. The programme embraces also large additions to the Cavalry Commissariat, Engineering, Railway, Signalling and Aviation Corps, and the creation of Heavy and Light Tank Corps. A certain Japanese general officer is credited with the remark that, however great the expense involved by this ambitious scheme may be, it will be a cheap price to pay for securing the tranquility and undisturbed prosperity of the Far East.
Had England,
He declared,
possessed 20 divisions on a peace footing, or what amounts to the same thing, had Germany expanded her army into one of formidable strength, the world's catastrophe might have been avoided. Such preparedness would have sufficed to deter resort to arms.
A Japanese infantry regiment contains 4 battalions, each of 600 men, a cavalry regiment 4 squadrons of 100 sabres each. A field artillery regiment has 6 4-gun batteries, or a total of 24 guns, while an engineers battalion consists of 3 companies, each 300 strong. In accordance with the lessons of the World War, very substantial additions are being made to the artillery, especially the heavier types, including field howitzers of 4.6-inch, 6-inch, 8-inch, 11-inch and 12-inch caliber, and high-velocity guns for long-range bombardment. The extension of the machine gun service began in 1917, and is proceeding at the rate of 10 new batteries per year. By 1927, perhaps before that date, every infantry regiment will have its own machine gun section, equivalent to a strength of 15 guns to a battalion. Besides the heavy and light tanks mentioned above, armoured cars and motor transport vehicles are being added to the army as rapidly as funds permit. A liberal bounty is now paid to manufacturers and owners who build their cars to War Office specification and hold them at the government's disposal in time of emergency. Conscription, which applies to all males in good physical condition between the ages of 17 and 40, has been in force since 1873. Recruits, however, are not taken until they reach their 20th year. After serving 2 years in the infantry, or 3 years in the cavalry, artillery, or other branches, they pass into the reserve for a period of about 5 years, during which they must undergo 120 days training with the colours. They are then transferred to the second line, in which they remain for 10 years, being called up for 2 60-day periods of training. On passing out of the second line, they enter the Territorial, or Home Defence Army for 32 months. This system, it will be seen, provides a huge reserve of trained manpower. Discipline in the Japanese army tends to be draconic, and although soldiering is very popular with the nation as a whole, the severity with which the rank and file are treated leads to many cases of desertion, a crime which has lately shown an increase. It may be accepted as certain that by 1922 the peace strength of the Japanese army will not be less than 300,000 of all ranks, with a first-line reserve of 250,000 and a second line of 1,150,000 men. Since it is a most unlikely fact that the mobilization would be publicly announced, a formal declaration of hostilities would probably find at least 1 million troops under arms, ready to start for any destination overseas. The transport problem would present no difficulty whatever. Thanks to the impulse given by the war, the Japanese mercantile marine has increased by leaps and bounds since 1914, the increment amounting to approximately 1,300,000 tons. Before the war, Japan occupied the 6th place among the maritime countries of the world. Today she occupies the 3rd place, and, in spite of the slump which has recently set in, she is still hard at work on the production of tonnage, her output for 1920 alone reaching 400,000 tons. The national merchant fleet now totals well over 3 million tons. The system of state subsidies has encouraged the building of many large and fast steamers for the services maintained by such well-known firms as the Nihon Yusen Kaisha, which operates lines to Europe, America, Australia, and India. The Osaka Shosen Kaisha, which began by inaugurating a coastal service and now has vessels running between Japan, Europe, South America, and the South Sea Islands. The Toyo Kisen Kaisha, which owns a fleet of high-speed steamers running to San Francisco and South American ports. The Nissin Kisen Kaisha, a concern that dominates the Chinese coasting and river traffic, and the Nanyo Yusen Kaisha, whose vessels ply mainly between Kobe and the Dutch East Indies. In addition to these leading companies, there are many other firms which own fleets of steamers well adapted to military transport service. In January 1921, the number of steamers of 4,000 tons and upwards was 130, while the smaller vessels from 1,000 to 3,000 tons, which could be used as transports for short voyages, numbered 280. 95 of these vessels had speeds of 14 knots or more, including 11 which were able to steam at 18 to 21 knots. Every vessel registered in Japan of more than 1,500 tons and 14 knots speed is on the books of the Army Transport Section as a potential troop ship. The efficiency of this organisation was demonstrated in the war with Russia, and it has been greatly developed since that time. We may therefore assume that a Japanese expeditionary force of 50,000 men could be placed on board of a fleet of transports possessing an average speed of 15 knots within a few days from the issue of the mobilization order. If the embarkation took place at the southern ports of Japan, the voyage to the Philippines would occupy less than 5 days. Or if Guam were the objective, that island, distant only 1,360 miles from Yokohama, could be reached in 4 days. The presence of a strong American fleet in the western area of the Pacific would, of course, deter Japan from undertaking military expeditions of this kind. On the other hand, her conduct in previous wars justifies the supposition that she would take good care to open the campaign at her selected moment, which would certainly not coincide with the visit of a formidable American naval squadron to the western Pacific. The cruiser squadron present on Manila could offer no serious opposition to the Japanese battle fleet, and unless the ships sought safety in flight, which would be near impossible if Japanese battle cruisers were near at hand, their destruction would be inevitable. In view of the overwhelming strategic importance of Guam, this island would doubtless be the first Japanese objective. The reduction of its feeble defences would be a simple matter for the heavy ships, and, once the minefields had been cleared out and the batteries silenced, the landing would proceed with utmost celerity. The sanguinary fighting round Port Arthur in 1904 taught us that Japanese troops will cheerfully sacrifice themselves in hecatombs when the order goes forth to take an enemy position at all costs. Thus, the resistance which the small garrison of Marines would be able to offer could not stem for long the tidal wave of invasion. If the expeditionary force reached Guam at dawn, the Japanese might count on having firmly established themselves on the island before nightfall. A simultaneous attack on the Philippines and Guam would place no abnormal strain on Japanese naval, military, or shipping resources. In the case of the Philippines expedition, the landing itself would doubtless be made at one or more points where there were no seaward defences. The complete subjugation of the islands would not be attempted at once. It would suffice if the principal harbours were seized, garrisoned, and hastily fortified, an operation for which 2 weeks would be a liberal time allowance. The conclusion is that within a fortnight after the beginning of hostilities, the United States would find herself bereft of her insular possessions in the Western Pacific, and consequently without a single base for naval operations in those waters. Those who demur at what may seem a somewhat startling statement are invited to examine the premises on which it rests, and to judge for themselves whether any other inference can be drawn therefrom. With Guam and the Philippines in enemy hands, the problem confronting the United States would become well nigh insolvable. Here it may be interpolated that Japanese strategists, who have discussed in an academic way the possibilities of such a war, as that we are now considering, have satisfied themselves that at this stage the United States would negotiate for peace, realizing the impossibility of retrieving the situation. In their case, the wish is probably father to the thought. Whatever view the American government might take, it is scarcely conceivable that public opinion in the United States would tolerate a passive acceptance of the accomplished fact, and own defeat at the very outset of the struggle. It is far more likely that a vociferous demand for action of some sort would arise, strong enough to compel the government to bow to the popular will. If so, several courses would be open to the American Naval Command, but whether any of them would lead to the desired goal is doubtful. They might assemble the whole of their effective battle fleet at Hawaii, and improvise an advanced base at Wake Island, whence they could either demonstrate off the Japanese coast, or make a bold attempt to recapture Guam. The former alternative might or might not bring about an action with the main Japanese fleet, though it is hardly to be expected that the Japanese would needlessly hazard the tremendous advantage they had won. Moreover, a stay of any length in Japanese waters would expose the American fleet to intensive submarine attack, the perils of which would be aggravated by the necessity of steaming at moderate speed in order to economize fuel. If the fleet were to cruise at high speeds, its coal and oil would soon be exhausted, and it would be compelled to return to Wake Island for fresh supplies, since the operation of coaling or oiling at sea would be attended with too much risk for submarine-infested waters. Wake Island, however, would afford no secure refuge for a large fleet. Not only are its anchorage facilities limited, but it is situated only a few hundred miles north of the Marshall Islands, which would probably become the rendezvous of Japanese submarines. In these circumstances, heavy losses would be almost inevitable. Nor must it be forgotten that serious damage from torpedo, mine, or other cause would be equivalent to total loss in view of the absence of docks and repairing plant. Any attempt to tow a damaged ship from Wake to Honolulu, a distance of 2,010 miles, would be hopeless if enemy submarines were about. For the same reason, a fleet action fought in the Western Pacific would be a most perilous adventure for the Americans, who, being without a proper base, could reckon with certainty on losing every disabled ship. It is just possible that the knowledge of their enemy's predicament in this respect might tempt the Japanese fleet to accept battle. If so, they would have many points in their favour to balance the numerical superiority of their opponents. First, they would be fighting at no great distance from their great naval bases, and would therefore arrive on the scene of action in a condition of maximum fighting efficiency, and with the knowledge that a short and secure line of retreat lay open to ships that might suffer injury. Secondly, they could emerge with the whole of their serviceable heavy ships, cruisers, and destroyers, including older boats of limited fuel capacity, whereas it is extremely doubtful whether the American fleet would be accompanied by more than a portion of its full complement of destroyers. Thirdly, they would possess in their 4 battlecruisers of the Congo class a squadron of heavily armed ships at least 6 knots faster than the American battleships. The first American battleship will not be ready before 1923, thereby gaining a tactical advantage of the highest importance. Fourthly, having decided to fight, they would proceed to call up every available submarine, ordering these boats to lie in wait to attack the American fleet before and after the action. This list does not by any means exhaust the advantages that the Japanese would enjoy, but it will serve to show that the numerical preponderance of the Americans would be heavily discounted by other factors. Any attempt to predict the course of events after action had been joined would be profitless. On paper, at least, the contemporary battleships of the two powers are well matched. The Huso, Yamashiro, Ise, and Hyuga are individually equal to such ships as the Pennsylvania or the New Mexico, and somewhat better than the New York and Texas. They are also faster by 1.5 or 2 knots. In 1922, each fleet will include 2 of the new 16-inch gun battleships. On the Japanese side, the Nagato and Mutsu. On the American side, the Maryland and Colorado. Failing authentic data, it is impossible to say whether either fleet has a marked superiority in gunnery. All that can be said with confidence is that the shooting on both sides would be excellent, since both navies devote ceaseless attention to the gunnery branch. Japanese officers affirm, however, that battle practice in their navy has been developed by methods more scientific and effective than those in vogue in the American service. Be this as it may, it is a fact that the Japanese Navy, as early as 1915, was using fire control instruments which were not introduced into the American Navy until 1917 or later. The Americans would be sorely handicapped by their want of fast cruisers and aircraft carriers, and would suffer a further disadvantage by reason of their inferior speed. It is most improbable that the action would be fought to a finish, for the Japanese could gain nothing by exposing themselves to the crushing preponderance of the American broadsides. They would be more likely to use their superior speed as a means of breaking off the action when it suited them, leaving their destroyers, submarines, and torpedo planes to harass the enemy and administer the coup de grace to his disabled ships. For the Americans, any result short of a complete and overwhelming victory would be tantamount to defeat for the reasons already propounded, and the Japanese could be trusted to employ tactics which would rule out the chance of such a decisive issue to the encounter. The action would probably be fought at very long range. The atmospheric conditions in those latitudes permit of visual observation at greater distances than are possible in Europe, and some of the best naval shooting records have been made in Far Eastern waters. Then, too, the Japanese, having the highest speed, would be certain to fight at their own range, and avoid closing to a distance at which the heavy American salvos could be concentrated with deadly precision. The presence of many destroyers with both fleets would be another factor tending to militate against close action. All modern American destroyers carry 12 torpedo tubes, 6 in each broadside, so that a mass attack by these boats would be a very serious business for the enemy. On the other hand, the Japanese boats have a heavier gun armament, the value of which was clearly demonstrated at Jutland and other naval engagements of the Great War. It is unlikely that the American battle fleet would include any pre-dreadnoughts, but in view of their opponents' lack of battlecruisers, the Japanese might deem it worthwhile to reinforce their fleet with such ships as the Aki, Satsuma, Kurama, Ibuki, and Ikoma, which would be fast enough to keep out of harm's way and powerful enough to deal with anything short of a dreadnought. While an action fought under the circumstances described would most probably be indecisive so far as material results were concerned, it would nevertheless tend to confirm the supremacy of the Japanese in the Western Pacific, and leave the Americans in no better position than before. Owing to the great distances to be covered, raids by either side on enemy territory would be too difficult and dangerous to make them worthwhile. But so long as Hawaii remained the principal base of the American fleet, the Japanese submarines would probably be active in that quarter. The United States continental seaboard might also receive flying visits from the large Japanese submarines, in which case the Americans could return the compliment by sending the few long-range submersibles they possess to operate off the coast of Japan. It is doubtful whether either belligerent could interfere with the other's seaborne trade to any serious extent. Japan would have no difficulty in protecting her communications with Europe, and American shipping would have little to fear from commerce raiders in the Eastern Pacific or the Atlantic. With the possible exception of raids on the Alaskan fishing fleet, the Japanese could undertake no further offensive operation, and the naval campaign would therefore be brought practically to a standstill. Having considered the possibilities of a Pacific campaign in which all the advantages of position and base power were on the side of Japan, let us now examine the very different situation that would exist if war was deferred until Guam had been converted into a strong place of arms. The science of fortification has made such progress that this island could be rendered virtually impregnable to naval attack. Batteries of 16-inch or 14-inch guns on high-angle mountings would have a range at least 10,000 yards in excess of that of any guns mounted on shipboard, and a hostile fleet would thus come under fire long before it could reply. Guns mounted ashore in emplacements protected by massive armour and concrete are almost impossible to put out of action, and for the reasons explained in an earlier chapter, their fire can be directed with extraordinary precision, even at the longest ranges. An equal degree of accuracy can never be attained when firing from a ship. During the Great War, coastal bombardments were reduced to a fine art in the Dover Patrol, yet, according to Admiral Bacon, the mathematical chance of hitting a lock gate at Zeebrugge, a larger target than would be offered by a gun mounted ashore, assuming absolute accurate aiming, was once every 67 rounds. But since aiming from a ship can never be quite accurate, the chances of making even this limited number of hits from a moving platform are substantially less than the mathematical calculation would suggest. At the same time, the formidable nature of fire from heavy-caliber guns mounted ashore was repeatedly demonstrated in the operations off the Belgian coast. On one occasion, the Monitor Lord Clive was heavily shelled by the German batteries at ranges between 18,000 and 22,000 yards, the salvos falling with uncanny precision, and several direct hits being made. It was found subsequently that the German 12 and 15-inch guns could make very straight shooting, up to 32,000 yards. The new American 16-inch 50 caliber gun at full elevation would have a range of 45,000 yards, and a single hit from its 2,100-pound shell, descending at a very steep angle, might prove fatal to the largest battleship. A limited number of these weapons, so mounted as to command the line of approach to the few landing places in Guam, would probably suffice to keep the strongest fleet at a respectful distance. If, in addition, a flotilla of submarines were based on the island, the Japanese would never dream of attempting to carry out a joint naval and military attack. Guam, therefore, could be made safe at no great expenditure of time or money, though the building of an artificial harbour large enough to contain a great battle fleet would prove a somewhat expensive undertaking. American ability to defend the Philippines would primarily depend on the size and nature of the naval force that was available at Guam on the outbreak of hostilities. Whether submarines alone would be sufficient is doubtful, since recent war experience has shown that large convoys of troopships can be given adequate protection against this form of attack. The knowledge that American submarines were cruising in the vicinity would not necessarily deter the Japanese from launching a military expedition overseas. The islands, therefore, might fall in any case, but their occupation by Japan would not determine their final status. The arrival of a powerful United States fleet at Guam would not only imperil the Japanese line of communications, but enable the Americans to set about the task of recovering the Philippines. The transportation from Hawaii, the most convenient point of concentration, to Guam, a distance of 3,300 miles, of a military force strong enough to recapture the islands, would be attended with great difficulty and danger, but would not be impossible. And, considering the vital importance of the issues at stake, the risks involved would almost certainly be accepted. After all, some 2 million United States troops were brought across 3,000 miles of Atlantic Ocean in defiance of Germany's submarines, and there is no apparent reason why this performance should not be repeated on a much more modest scale in the Pacific. Though it is true that the Americans would not have as many large and fast transports as were at their disposal on the first occasion, that the operation would be attended with fairly heavy loss is more or less inevitable. The transports would have to run the gauntlet of Japanese submarines working from bases in the South Sea Islands, and the danger zone would extend from Hawaii right across the Pacific. Moreover, the possibility of hostile battlecruisers coming out to attack the troopships would necessitate the provision of dreadnought battleships as convoy guards. The Americans, however, could spare at least 6 dreadnoughts for this work without reducing the strength of their battle fleet below the limit of safety. Assuming all these risks to have been taken, the accumulation of a great expeditionary force at Guam would be chiefly a question of time and ability to keep the transoceanic route reasonably safe, a problem complicated by the proximity of Japanese bases in the Marianne, Marshall, and Palau Islands. The whole operation would tax the naval, military, and shipping resources of the United States to their utmost capacity, and would demand a national effort far greater than the American people had to put forth during the World War. For some time, at any rate, no encouraging successes against the enemy could be looked for. On the contrary, the nation might have to endure a painful series of disasters to warships, troopships, and supply vessels on the long and perilous route from Hawaii to Guam, for it goes without saying that the Japanese, on their part, would strain every nerve to arrest the great westward movement of American manpower. The contest, therefore, would be one of morale as well as of material. The Japanese might consider it profitable to make spasmodic submarine raids on the American seaboard, hoping to spread such alarm in the coast towns as would lead to demands for local protection, and thus embarrass the plans of the naval authorities. As regards the actual work of convoying transports and supply ships across the Pacific, it should not be forgotten that the Americans gained invaluable experience in this direction during the World War. Nor is the submarine so potent an adversary today as it was 3 or 4 years ago. Since then, the counter-offensive has developed far more rapidly than the attack, with the result that convoys could now be given a less qualified guarantee of safety than was possible in 1917 and 18. The special disadvantage under which submarines labour in the Pacific, owing to the tremendous depth of water in certain areas, have already been mentioned, and this fact would materially facilitate the protection of convoys against underwater attack. Practically all the existing methods of submarine detection are based on the sound produced by the engines of such craft when in motion. German submarines operating in the waters of Europe were frequently able to defeat these methods by lying on the bottom, but it would only rarely be possible for submarines working in the Pacific to adopt this expedient. As a rule, they would be compelled to keep their engines in motion when below the surface, and in this way would be liable to detection by hydrophones and other listening devices long before they could come within torpedo range. It is worth noting in this connection that the direct route between Hawaii and Guam traverses two of the greatest depressions in the Western Pacific, viz. Bailey Deep and Brook Deep, where the depth averages 3,400 fathoms. Once detected, any submarine operating in this neighbourhood would itself be in deadly peril. To remain submerged, it would have to keep its electric motors running, thus betraying its whereabouts to the listening hydrophones, and when its batteries were exhausted, as they would be at the end of 100 miles or so, it would have to come to the surface to recharge them, thereby exposing itself to attack by destroyers or other pursuing craft, surface and aerial. For these reasons, the submarine is far less dangerous in the Pacific than in areas where the depth conditions are such as to permit a boat to lie on the bottom. Consequently, it is not expected that Japanese submarines, however skillfully and gallantly they were handled, would be able to prevent the transport of a United States Army across the Pacific. But the task before the Americans would not be completed when they had concentrated a powerful military force at Guam, together with the necessary stocks of provisions, material, and equipment. The next step would be to retake the Philippines, and while there is no reason to suppose this impossible, it would undoubtedly prove a difficult and costly enterprise. The distance of 1,510 miles between Guam and Manila could be covered in 4 days by a fleet of transports steaming at 16 knots, but the passage to Manila would be extremely hazardous, leading as it does through a maze of islets, where the channel in some places is so confined that ships must navigate it singly, and in these circumstances it would be impossible for the escorting warships to give effective protection against submarine and destroyer attack. Probably, therefore, the shorter route to Mindanao, or to some point on the eastern shore of Luzon, would be selected, in which case the journey could be made in 3.5 days. It is reasonable to suppose that the Japanese would have been apprised by their naval or aerial scouts, or through their Secret Service agents, of what was in the wind, but they would have no exact foreknowledge of the point at which the Americans intended to land, and such defences as they were able to improvise would be too feeble to withstand a heavy bombardment from the battleships. Nevertheless, with equal courage and determination on both sides, the landing would prove a desperate and sanguinary business, and its success or failure would depend in the last resort on individual gallantry and determination. One lesson that the World War clearly taught was that no artificial obstacles can check the onward rush of men who have firmly resolved to gain their objective at all costs. After Gallipoli and Zeebrugge, it would be unsafe to say that any fortified position can be made impregnable to a storming party of trained fighting men inspired by an iron will to conquer. Once the Americans had contrived to gain a foothold in the Philippines, they could pour in sufficient troops from the reservoir at Guam to overcome the enemy's resistance. Japan might also attempt to send reinforcements, but the sailing of troop ships would be a risky proceeding in view of American naval superiority, especially as the voyage from the southernmost Japanese ports would be almost as long as that from Guam. In the end, she would be forced either to abandon the Philippines or fight a naval action to decide the command of the sea, and an action fought under such conditions, with the superior American fleet fresh from its nearby base, would be a very dangerous adventure for the Japanese. That it would end victoriously for them is most improbable in view of all the factors involved, and an indecisive result would bring them no advantage, while defeat, whether partial or complete, would have the gravest consequences. The recovery of the Philippines, together with the possession of a strong and well-stocked base at Guam, would enable the United States to wage offensive war against the foe. Her battleships would be within 3 days' steaming of the Japanese coast, and, although the latter is too well defended to be susceptible to serious attack, rapid bombardments of the more exposed localities might be undertaken with comparative impunity. Infinitely more serious to Japan would be the distant blockade which the Americans could now proceed to establish. With a moderate force of cruisers and armed boarding steamers, reinforced by destroyers and submarines, they would be in a position to intercept the majority of vessels bound for Japanese ports, especially those coming from Europe. A glance at the chart will show how admirably such bases as Manila and Guam are situated for a fleet engaged in this work. Owing to her dearth of fast cruisers, the United States could not hope to reap the full benefit of a strategical advantage in this respect, but at least she could reckon on virtually paralysing the seaborne trade of her enemy, and a prolonged interruption of this commerce might eventually force the island empire to its knees. Meanwhile, the rigours of the blockade would doubtless be intensified by aerial attacks on the great naval ports and industrial centres. The huge American NC flying boats, when accompanied by their depot ships, have a radius of many thousands of miles. To illustrate the remarkable capabilities of these machines, a cruise recently made by a squadron of 6 of them may be briefly described. The NC type, a unit of which flew across the Atlantic in 1919, are large twin-engined biplanes fitted with a stout hull which enables them to alight on the surface of the sea and to ride out really heavy weather. They have a span of 103 feet, an overall length of 50 feet, and weigh, fully loaded, 6.5 tons each. They are driven by 2 400-horsepower Liberty motors, which give them a maximum speed of about 100 miles an hour. Their equipment includes wireless apparatus, anchors, mooring gear, and an emergency repair outfit. Normally each boat carries a crew of 2 pilots, 2 engineers, and a wireless operator, but on the cruise in question they carried additional personnel, and the squadron of 6 had a total complement of between 50 and 60 men on board. Leaving Philadelphia in November 1919, they made a 7-month cruise to the Caribbean Sea and the West Indies, and returned to Philadelphia in June 1920, after covering a distance of no less than 12,731 miles, under their own power, without serious mishap or loss of life. The squadron was accompanied on its voyage by the minelayer Shawmut as a mothership, and the minesweeper Sandpiper as a repair and fuel ship. As a rule, the Sandpiper preceded the squadron from port to port, with the Shawmut bringing up the rear, keeping a vigilant lookout for machines which might have met with accident. Both ships acted, therefore, as a movable base, though the facilities they possessed were necessarily restricted. It was not found necessary, however, to dock the flying boats, and repairs of a nature which required the boats to be lifted from the water were few and far between, the crews themselves carrying out minor repairs en route. As each flying boat carried its own anchor and cable, the machines came to anchor at various ports of call in the same way as ordinary surface vessels. Landings were frequently made in the open sea with the wind blowing at a velocity of 40 knots, and on more than one occasion the boats rode safely and undamaged through an 80-knot gale. The weather encountered shortly after the cruise began was such as to impose a severe test on the airworthiness and nautical qualities of the squadron, and the behaviour of the machines is held to have demonstrated that flying boats of this type are capable of carrying on active operations over periods of time hitherto considered out of the question. An incident which occurred on the outward voyage showed that the large flying boat is becoming practically independent of weather conditions. On December 11th, 1919, the squadron was due to leave Savannah for Cumberland Sound, and, in spite of the storm warnings sent out from the Coast Guard stations along the Atlantic coast, the whole squadron put to sea without hesitation. In the teeth of a heavy northeast gale, it made the voyage in safety, reaching Cumberland Sound at the appointed time. A large destroyer was found at anchor in the roadstead, the commanding officer of which expressed amazement that the machine should have ventured to fly in such tempestuous weather. En route from Sanchez, Santo Domingo to San Juan, Puerto Rico, the squadron met with a heavy tropical rainstorm. The machines were cruising in formation when, without warning, the gloom and rain squalls became so dense that vision was limited to a few hundred feet. So intense was the darkness that the flash of the motor exhaust was clearly visible. Yet through all this driving rain and wind, which finally changed to violent squalls, the machines held to their course for 90 miles, reaching the Puerto Rican coast, and skirting the shore for a further 120 miles to San Juan, which they reached punctually to time, and came to a safe anchorage in the harbour without mishap, having covered a distance of 210 miles at the rate of a mile a minute. When the squadron lay at Sanchez, the swell in the roadstead was so heavy that the mothership Shormut, a vessel of nearly 4,000 tons, rolled violently, but the flying boats rode smoothly at their anchors, and in due course took off from this rough water with ease. On reaching the Guantanamo fleet base, the squadron was employed for several weeks in wireless exercises, making flights for anti-aircraft sighting practice and fire control observation, bomb dropping, night flying operations, and as tenders for the transport of personnel, at the conclusion of which they flew back to Philadelphia, as stated above. The performance of this squadron was officially summarized as below. Total number of flights, all machines, 495. Average length of each flight, 2 hours and 25 minutes. Flights in passage, 8,210 nautical miles. Other flights incidental to fleet operations, scouting, and observing for gunfire, 4,521 nautical miles. Total distance flown by the squadron as a whole, 12,731 nautical miles. Total mileage of all machines, 71,545 nautical miles. Total hours flown, 1,192 hours, 25 minutes. Fatalities or serious injuries during flying operations, none. The foregoing details of this remarkable performance are given to show that the American Navy already possesses a most formidable air weapon, which could be used with terrible effect against the enemy's dockyards and industrial centres. This arm is now being developed on a very large scale, and the programs in hand are designed to give the American Pacific Fleet alone an establishment of 100 large bombing and torpedo planes and 50 high-speed scouting planes, all of which are to be in service by midsummer 1922. It is proposed to build several fast aircraft carriers, but in the meantime the fuel ship Jupiter, displacing nearly 20,000 tons with a speed of 15 knots, is being converted into a seaplane transport and will be attached to the Pacific Fleet. The unenviable position in which Japan would find herself if beset by a foe who had gained command of the sea has been vividly portrayed by a Japanese writer, Mr. Nakamura, who refers also to the danger of attack from the air. The necessity for Admiral Kato's new program must be evident to all who have studied the naval problems of the near future. For Japan, the control of certain areas of the Pacific is a matter of life and death. It is sometimes argued that this control need not extend beyond the Sea of Japan and the Yellow Sea, which may be termed our narrow seas. This betrays a complete misapprehension of the situation. At no point of the World War did Germany lose command of the Heligoland Bight or of the Baltic, and she was therefore able to guard her coastline from naval attack. But this did not save her from the fatal pressure of the blockade, the operation of which was the real cause of her defeat. Nor, in our case, would the undisputed command of the Sea of Japan protect us from blockade. It would be within the power of a superior naval opponent to strangle our commerce and cut off our supplies without sending a single ship into the Sea of Japan. The majority of the merchant ships entering Japanese ports traverse certain steamer lanes, which the enemy would have no difficulty in closing. Having established a blockade, he would certainly endeavour to undermine our resistance by attacking exposed parts of the coast with his battleships, submarines, and aircraft. Many of the great commercial and naval harbours would be open to attack, being well informed as to our resources, would know in what direction to concentrate his efforts. On the Pacific coast, the capital of Tokyo, the huge entrepot of Yokohama, and the naval arsenal of Yokosuka would lie open to the visitations of hostile flying machines. Osaka, the capital of our national industry, would not be beyond an enemy's reach, and the swarming industrial hives of Kyushu would present him with innumerable targets. Our coast defences, submarines, and torpedo boats might be able to prevent the near approach of hostile armour-clads, but would do nothing against an invading air fleet. The sole defence against this form of attack is a battle fleet of sufficient power to sweep the outer seas and make it impossible for the enemy to send out his aircraft-carrying vessels. Sea power and air power have already become synonymous terms, but above and beyond all, we must provide ourselves with an adequate battle fleet if the safety of the Empire is to be assured. This writer has not exaggerated the dire consequences to Japan of an unsuccessful campaign in the Western Pacific. His purpose in reciting them was to enlist popular support for the government's ambitious naval schemes, but his arguments might be employed with equal effect in justification of a less aggressive policy. End of section 16. Section 17 of Sea Power in the Pacific by Hector Charles Bywater. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Alister. Chapter 11. War or Peace? Political and Economic Factors. In the foregoing chapters, an endeavour has been made to assess the naval strength of the United States and Japan respectively, and to elucidate the peculiar strategical conditions that would govern an armed conflict for the mastery of the Pacific. It would, however, be misleading to judge the possibilities of such a conflict solely from the naval point of view, and our survey would be incomplete if it omitted to take into account certain other factors which must exercise a weighty, perhaps even a decisive influence on the course and ultimate issue of a war between the two powers named. Those factors may be conveniently grouped under two headings, political and economic, and it is proposed to examine both as briefly as their importance permits. As regards the first, it will simplify matters if we start by postulating that the Anglo-Japanese alliance would not come into operation in the event of a war between Japan and the United States. While that assumption may be challenged by persons who have an interest in promoting friction between the two great English-speaking commonwealths, it will be endorsed without hesitation by everyone who knows the prevailing temper of the British people at home and in the Dominions. In Australasia and Canada, at all events, the mere suggestion of an armed league with Japan against the United States would be repudiated with indignation, if only because public opinion in those countries unreservedly sympathises with the American attitude on the racial question. This truth is clearly recognised in Japan, where the press in recent years has treated the alliance as an obsolete instrument of no practical value. Several journals, especially the Rodzu and Yamato Shimbun, have recommended its denunciation on the ground that it has become more of a hindrance than a help to Japanese policy. That the alliance has lost much of its original significance must be plain to every observer, concluded in the first instance as a mutual guarantee against Russia, who at the time was credited with designs both on Manchuria and India. It served its main purpose by keeping the ring clear during the Russo-Japanese War, a struggle in which Japan would not have engaged but for the knowledge that she was secured against French and possibly German intervention. Her enthusiasm for the alliance began to cool immediately after the victorious issue of that conflict, which, by breaking the military power of Russia, left her free to prosecute her aims in Korea and Manchuria. Nevertheless, she deemed it expedient to adhere to the compact in view of the possibility that Germany might succeed Russia as a candidate for political supremacy in the Far East. Now this danger has been averted by Germany's defeat in the Great War and her expulsion from Jiaozhou. Japanese statesmen may well ask themselves whether the British alliance has not outlived its usefulness. Nothing is to be gained by disguising the fact that Japanese friendship for Great Britain has perceptibly cooled in the last few years. This change of sentiment was strikingly revealed during the operations at Qingdao in 1914. The German stronghold in Shantung was invested by a Japanese force, to which was attached a small contingent of British troops under General Barnardiston. As the first occasion on which British and Japanese had fought side by side against a common enemy, it was anticipated that this joint campaign would be attended with the happiest results. The truth is, however, that the whole business was marred by misunderstanding and recrimination, and though the facts were never officially published, they gave rise to a great deal of acrid comment in the Japanese press. British subjects who were resident in the Far East at the time unanimously agree that throughout the Great War, Japanese opinion, official as well as popular, was decidedly sympathetic to Germany and antagonistic towards the Allies. In 1916, when the prospects of a German victory seemed to be good, the newspapers, with very few exceptions, launched a violent campaign against the Anglo-Japanese alliance and indulged in such vituperative language against Great Britain that the government finally interfered. This episode showed that Japanese opinion had developed Anglophobe tendencies, a fact unfortunately confirmed by many later incidents. According to Mr. McGovern, all military authorities, whatever their sympathies, and generally speaking naval circles were pro-British and the army people pro-German, had made up their minds that the Germans were going to win, or at least fight a drawn battle. In fact, he adds,
"It was well known that the German government had made all preparations for necessary action in case of a German victory."
Towards the close of 1917, a new press campaign was opened, this time in favour of an alliance with the German Empire. The idea received particularly ardent support from those journals and magazines which enjoyed a large circulation among the well-to-do and intellectual classes. Some of them went so far as to advocate a German-Russian-Japanese alliance, which, they maintained, could dominate the world, and this suggestion was in favour even after the revolution and defection of Russia. No good purpose could be served by reproducing the violent attacks which Japanese periodicals of the highest standing saw fit to make upon Great Britain, and the cause for which she was fighting. On the other hand, it is desirable that the British people should know of this significant change of feeling on the part of a nation which they have long been accustomed to regard and treat as a staunch friend. Any lingering doubts as to the political sentiments of the Japanese military caste will be dispelled by reading Colonel Ward's narrative of his experiences with the Siberian expedition. But if the former cordial friendship between the two nations has given place, on one side at least, to distrust and veiled antipathy, it would be wrong to impute the change solely to Oriental caprice or perversity. Japan feels, not unreasonably, that if she were to become involved in a conflict arising out of the racial question, it would be vain to expect help from the British people, and since this issue is at the root of her quarrel with the United States, she argues, with unassailable logic, that the British Empire can at best be only an unsympathetic neutral. She knows full well that her subjects are welcomed as coldly in Canada and Australia as in the United States. Hence the opposition manifested by her press to the renewal of the Anglo-Japanese alliance on any but the original terms, which the altered circumstances have, of course, made inadmissible. It is very true, as her publicists said in 1916, and have repeated many times since, that Japan must face the Pacific problem alone, and solve it unaided. There is no reason to suppose that help would be forthcoming from China, for Japanese policy in that quarter has not been of a nature to gain her the goodwill of the government or the people. It is far more likely that China would take advantage of a favourable opportunity to reassert in Manchuria and the Shantung Peninsula that sovereignty which the Japanese have done their best to overthrow. The statesmen of Tokyo must therefore reckon with China as a potential foe, or in any case as a neighbour whose neutrality would be the reverse of benevolent. Moreover, even within the Japanese Empire itself, there is a great deal of explosive material to which it would be dangerous to apply the torch of war. The Koreans, who have now been subjects of the Empire for 11 years, have never taken kindly to their Japanese masters, who still find it necessary to maintain a large force of troops and gendarmerie in order to repress the independence movement which appears to be gaining ground. The last outbreak, which occurred in the spring of 1919, attained alarming dimensions and was crushed with merciless severity. Owing to the strict censorship, it is difficult to obtain reliable news of the present situation in Korea, but the evidence of travellers indicates that popular unrest is increasing. This is not the place to comment on the methods by which Japan seeks to propagate her culture in the overseas territories she has acquired. All that need be said is that Japanese rule in Manchuria, Korea and Formosa still rests upon bayonets, and that the possession of these territories not only adds nothing to her military power, but sensibly diminishes it. There is, of course, an enormous disparity between the economic resources of the United States and the Japanese Empire, so much so that no question exists as to which could endure for the longest the terrible burden of a great war. In 1918, the latest year for which figures are available, the population of the continental United States was 105,250,000. That of Japan, excluding Korea and Formosa, 57,150,000. These figures, however, afford no true index to the relative position in regard to national wealth and productive capacity. The United States, although a great maritime power by virtue of its long coastline, its seaborne trade, and its naval armament, is not dependent on sea communications for its existence. It is self-supporting in food and raw materials to a far greater extent than any other power, with the possible exception of Russia. It could, for instance, raise, equip, and feed an army many millions strong without importing a ton of material from abroad. It has reserves of wealth which, if not boundless, are at any rate adequate to finance the longest and costliest war in which it is ever likely to be engaged. It has an industrial organization which is capable of producing war material of every description in unlimited quantities. More than this, its people, heterogeneous as they are, would be solidly behind the government in any crisis which arose out of the Asiatic immigration question. Organised labour in America would regard war in such a cause as a crusade undertaken to vindicate its most cherished principles. Indeed, we have seen that the labour element has been foremost in demanding the erection of barriers against the Oriental immigrant. Japan would therefore find herself opposed by a united people, outnumbering her 2-1, and possessing resources tenfold greater than those which she commands. In spite of all her industry, Japan remains relatively poor. A large part of the wealth she amassed during the Great War has already been mortgaged for the benefit of our armed forces. Her people are taxed to the limit of their endurance, yet the curve of expenditure goes steadily up. Her best friends, who entertain serious misgivings as to the economic future of Japan, are nevertheless satisfied that she will pull through, provided the temptation to embark upon further military adventures is resolutely resisted. What they fear is that the influence of the military caste, which looks upon war as a panacea for the social troubles which menace its supremacy, may be thrown into the scale of war. The members of this caste do not or will not see that war with the United States would be a very different affair from the previous wars with China and Russia, or if they do appreciate the difference, they are confident that the issue would be the same. It has been shown in the preceding chapters that the present strategical conditions in the Western Pacific are favourable to Japan, but where her militarists go wrong is in assuming that the United States would accept an initial reverse as final. If, as is all but certain, the struggle were to be protracted, no facile successes achieved in the beginning could avert the most ruinous consequences to the island empire. The United States could afford to wait. Japan could not. The inner history of the Russo-Japanese peace negotiations in 1905 has never been disclosed, but it is well known that Japan found it prudent to make peace, on terms none too favourable, at a moment when, to all appearances, she held every card in her hand. She was, in truth, at the end of her resources, with her reserves of manpower exhausted, her treasury empty, and her people war-weary to the point of active revolt. She had defeated Russia, only to be conquered in her turn by time. War with the United States might well prove a matter of years, and to those most competent to judge the financial position of Japan, the suggestion that her credit could stand the strain indefinitely is too absurd to be seriously discussed. Nor is bankruptcy the only risk that would have to be faced. Within the past 30 years, Japan has been transformed from an agricultural into an industrial community. The townward movement of the rural population has been especially marked in the last decade. Agriculture has proportionately declined, with the result that Japan no longer raises enough food for her own requirements, and is compelled to import a large and increasing proportion from foreign countries. This question of food supply was raised in the Diet during 1918, and in the same year the government appointed a commission to investigate the possibilities of increasing the rice and bean crops. It is believed that by employing modern methods and machinery, and extending the area of arable land by reclamation work, the rice crop could be increased by 20%. This, however, is not likely to happen unless the government is prepared to subsidise the farmers who live in a chronic state of poverty and cannot afford to buy modern implements. Under the present conditions, the domestic production of food suffices for the needs of only 4/5 of the population, the remainder being dependent on imported supplies mainly from Formosa, China, British India, and French Indochina. These would be liable to interruption in time of war, and might be entirely cut off were the enemy able to establish a blockade from bases in the Philippines and the South Sea Islands. Moreover, it is estimated that the home supply of food would be reduced by at least 1/5 by the calling up of army reservists. A prolonged war would inevitably result in a shortage of food and might even bring about famine conditions. Popular distress would be aggravated by widespread unemployment due to the suspension of foreign trade and the consequent closing down of factories, which give work to nearly 1.5 million men and women. A small proportion of these people would find employment in the munitions industry, but here the shortage of raw materials would soon make itself felt. It is exceedingly doubtful whether Japan could provide arms, equipment, and other necessities for her naval and military forces on a war footing for a longer period than 12 months if foreign supplies of material cease to be available. It is true that during the Great War, upwards of 100,000 Japanese workpeople were engaged in the manufacture of munitions and war equipment for the Allied powers, but this activity was made possible only by the stocks of raw material which the powers in question, and principally the United States, placed at the disposal of Japan. We have seen how, even in normal times, she is still largely dependent on foreign countries for her steel supply. The tremendous output of arms, ammunition, and maritime tonnage which formed such a notable chapter in the industrial history of Britain, Germany, and the United States during the Great War would be impossible in the case of Japan. By strictly rationing her limited stocks of steel and other essential material, she might be able, for a time, to cope with the demands of her navy and army, but she would certainly not be in a position to embark, for instance, on a large emergency program of naval construction. And concentration on the manufacture of war material would involve the virtual suspension of all other industrial activity. An economic crisis of the first magnitude would thus arise in any case, and the military party, by resorting to the desperate expedient of war as a means of averting social revolution, would be more likely to precipitate the very phenomenon they dread. One would credit the people of Japan with too much intelligence not to perceive the dangers to which an aggressive foreign policy must expose their empire. There are, however, unmistakable signs that wide circles of the nation have become imbued with the political doctrines of the Prussian school and hypnotized by the shibboleths which lured Germany to her ruin. The old cry of Weltmacht oder Niedergang, world power or downfall, has been taken up by the military caste, and is echoed with equal or greater conviction by the intellectuals and hard-headed men of business. The press as a whole argues that the future welfare and prosperity of Japan depend to a far greater extent on the size of her armaments than on the encouragement of national thrift, industry, and sound administration. It favours also a bold policy towards other powers, and an uncompromising insistence on the right of Japan to turn the resources of China to her own exclusive advantage. A disturbing symptom is the unqualified support which the great Japanese business interests are giving to this so-called forward policy. No newspapers are more bellicose in tone than those which circulate in the great industrial centres. The Kensei-kai, a political party of extreme nationalist views, which until very recently wielded a majority in the House of Representatives, is largely composed of businessmen. This was the party which, during the war period, led the campaign against the Anglo-Japanese alliance and urged the conclusion of a naval and military agreement with Germany. Its newspapers, lately, have been using violent language towards the United States, though their vituperative efforts in this direction have been rivalled by the independent organs such as the Tokyo Yorodzu and the Kokumin. In view of the strict hold which the government maintains over the press, the significance of these outbursts cannot be dismissed as negligible. It is particularly surprising that the business interests of Japan should be found supporting a political program which is calculated to foster international dissensions and may not impossibly lead to war, the disastrous results of which would fall most heavily upon them. The only explanation that suggests itself is that they consider war to be less of an evil than the social cataclysm which many of them believe to be imminent. They have been assured by the military chiefs that war with the United States would be a short and decisive affair, ending in a sweeping victory for the arms of Japan, and leaving her in undisputed control of the Far East, its markets, and its untapped wealth. By similar arguments, the German business interests were induced to throw in their lot with the Prussian war party, only to find, when too late, that they had compassed their own ruin and that of their fatherland. To foreign observers it seems that Japan has everything to lose and nothing to gain by a policy of aggressiveness. By sheer hard work and indomitable courage she has triumphed over the handicap of scanty natural resources and raised herself to a commanding position in the world. The problem of overpopulation has been solved in part by the annexation of Korea and Formosa, and of late years a new outlet, practically limitless in its possibilities, has been found in China. It is here, if anywhere, that Japan may realize her true destiny, and it is here that her claims for priority are less open to challenge than in any other quarter. There is plenty of room in China for all legitimate interests, and if Japan could bring herself to discard the methods she has borrowed from Prussia in favour of a policy of conciliation and genuine friendship with the Chinese people, she would eventually acquire in that quarter a predominance which could never be seriously contested. It remains to be seen whether her rulers and statesmen will have sufficient acumen to seize the unique opportunity thus presented to them, instead of hazarding the fortunes of Dai Nippon in a militarist gamble more reckless even than that which caused the ruin of the German Empire. End of section 17. End of Sea Power in the Pacific by Hector Charles Bywater.